No one was more thankful, for whom the Sierra Nevada was the range of light.
I think John Muir understood, as perhaps no one else has, how essential beauty is, natural beauty is to us. Without beauty, we have no kind of lubrication of the human spirit. We would just be dead. And that's really what drove him. That's what fueled him.
Clambering ecstatically over the mountainsides, Muir had become a self-taught expert in glaciers, a keen observer and lover of everything he encountered, from the tiniest specks of lichen on a rock to the mighty sequoias. And through his magazine articles, he had emerged as a wilderness prophet, a nationally known voice for preserved forests and unspoiled lands.
Near destroyers, tree killers, wool and mutton men, spreading death and confusion in the fairest groves and gardens ever planted. Let the government hasten to cast them out and make an end of them. Any fool can destroy trees. They cannot run away. And if they could, they would still be destroyed, chased and hunted down as long as fun or a dollar could be got out of their bark hides. Through all the wonderful, eventful centuries since Christ's time, and long before that, God has cared for these trees, saved them from drought, disease, avalanches, and 1,000 straining, leveling tempests and floods. But he cannot save them from fools. Only Uncle Sam can do that.
Yosemite's high country had been designated a national park in 1890, but the valley itself remained under the control of a California state commission and their political appointees, a group of blundering, plundering, money-making vote sellers, Muir said. He wanted it all transferred back to the federal government. Only then, he believed, would it be safe from ruin. In 1892, to help promote Yosemite's protection, Muir and a small group of prominent, the Sierra Club. Muir enthusiastically agreed to serve as its president, hoping, he said, that we will be able to do something for wildness and make the mountains glad.
In the 19th century, when the Census Bureau would do its census, it would draw a line, it's the frontier line, and proudly say it marches westward. And their definition of it had this wonderful phrase. It would say, the last 10 years, this many million of acres have been redeemed from wilderness by the hand of man. Redeemed from wilderness by the hand of man. In other words, loosened. That symbolized what our view of nature was as we were rushing across the continent. That's totally the opposite of what John Muir would say. Wilderness isn't redeemed by man. Man is redeemed by wilderness.
To know you are the first to set foot in homes that have unseen eyes watched, wondering what aliens were invading their sanctuaries, and why. The dust of centuries filled the rooms, and rose in thick clouds.
A few months before Rudyard Kipling visited Yellowstone, cowboys searching for stray cattle in southwestern Colorado, along the edge of a high plateau known as Mesa Verde, came upon the ruins of an ancient city tucked into the side of a cliff. Using a tree trunk and their lariats, they improvised a ladder and descended for a closer look.
The vanished people. Things were arranged in the rooms, as if people might just have been out visiting somewhere.
Came across even more ruins, nestled into the remote canyon walls of Mesa Verde, and gave names to them all. Cliff Palace, Spruce Tree House, Balcony House. It was the largest concentration ever found of the cliff dwellings, built, occupied, and then mysteriously deserted nearly 1,000 years earlier by the ancestors of some of the modern Pueblo Indians of the Southwest.
We knew that if we did not break into that charmed world, someone else would, sometime. Someone who might not love and respect those
The Wetherells, 5 brothers from a family of Quakers who had moved to Colorado from Kansas 8 years earlier. The oldest was Richard, who encouraged them all to spend every free moment digging among the ruins, hoping to sell their discoveries to museums in big cities.
We had started in as just ordinary pot hunters. Scientific knowledge, by careful work and comparisons.
One day, a stranger showed up, a young Swedish nobleman with an interest in archaeology, Gustav Nordenskjöld. When the Wetherells showed him the ruins, his enthusiasm, one of the brothers remembered, increased almost beyond his control, teaching them more scientific methods. He showed them how to use insisted on labeling and photographing everything, and often saved items, dried pieces of human excrement that ones had been eating so long ago. In all, he amassed hundreds of items, which he intended to ship home to Sweden. But when his pack animals, loaded down with artifacts, reached the railway station in Durango, Nordenskjöld was immediately arrested.
The basic problem was this foreigner is stealing our relics, our bowl. For those foreigners to do it, Gustav's lawyer asked the judge, under what law are we arresting you? And there was no law. There was no law at all. So they couldn't stop him. They couldn't stop anybody. And that probably sparked some interest. Why isn't there a law?
Nordenskjöld was released and got to take his huge shipment home to Scandinavia, where he published the first scientific study of the cliff dwellers. But the controversy had brought worldwide attention to Mesa Verde and to the fact that its treasures were completely unprotected.
We have seen the Indian and the game retreat before the white man and the cattle, and beheld the tide of immigration move forward, which threatens before long to leave plow or untrodden by his flocks. There is one spot left, a single rock, about which this tide will break and past which it will sweep, leaving it undefiled by the unsightly traces of civilization. Here, in this Yellowstone Park, the large game of the West may be preserved from extermination. In this, their last refuge. George Bird Grinnell.
By the 1890s, few Americans understood as keenly as George Bird Grinnell, the editor and owner of Forest and Stream magazine, how fearful the price had been for the nation's relentless expansion across the continent. Raised on the estate of the famous painter and naturalist John James Audubon at the north end of Manhattan, Grinnell could remember spotting a bald eagle from his bedroom window and watching immense flocks of passenger pigeons darkening the sky from horizon to horizon as they passed overhead. Traveling across Kansas, he had once encountered a buffalo herd so vast that his train was forced to stop for 3 hours while the beasts crossed the tracks. He had hunted elk in Nebraska when elk could still be found on the plains, ridden with the Pawnees in a great buffalo chase as the Indians brought down their prey with bows and arrows. Now, all that and so much more suddenly seemed gone or on the verge of disappearing. Passenger pigeons had been so systematically killed that a bird once numbering in the hundreds of millions had been reduced to a handful, and soon the death of a solitary bird in a Cincinnati zoo would bring an end to the species' existence. The hide hunters had been equally effective with the buffalo. By the mid-1880s, the last of the great free-roaming herds had been slaughtered. Now, the only wild herd left in the country was in Yellowstone National Park, estimated at only a few hundred animals.
Rapidly and as thoroughly as we knew how, and making no provision toward replacing the supply of the little that remains for ourselves and our children.
Grinnell regularly used the pages of Forest and Stream to try to point Americans in a new direction. It wasn't that he was against hunting. In fact, he loved to hunt. Grinnell just feared that without wise management, there would be nothing left for hunters to shoot. He proposed the creation of a new organization aimed at stopping the heedless killing of wild birds. In honor, Grinnell wrote, of the man who did more to teach Americans about birds of their own land than any other who ever lived. He named the group the Audubon Society. And when Grinnell published a mildly critical review of Theodore Roosevelt's book, turned the awkward moment into the beginning of a lasting friendship, and together formed the Boone and Crockett Club to promote what they called the manly sport of hunting.
But Grinnell had other larger issues in mind that he wanted to steer Teddy Roosevelt toward. And I think over time he became something of a mentor to Roosevelt, taking this energetic guy, this guy who was a political star, a rising political star, and gradually pointing him in directions that were to bring them to fruition.
As president of the state to keep Yellowstone as pristine as possible, open it up to greater commercial exploitation. Roosevelt helped defeat them all. But despite those successes, there was still no federal law giving Yellowstone's caretaker. On March 13, 1894, 2 troopers out on patrol in Yellowstone heard shots in the distance and hurried in that direction. Soon they came across several buffalo carcasses. A man was hunched over one of them, so busily skinning it that he didn't realize the troopers were there until methodically killing as many buffaloes as he could was also in the park, with a photographer, to do an article about Yellowstone in the winter. When the poacher bragged that the worst punishment he could receive for his crime was expulsion from the park and the loss of only $26 worth of equipment, Huff realized he had stumbled onto a great story and quickly telegraphed it to Grinnell in New York City. Grinnell knew just what to do with it.
Grinnell just pulled out all the stops. He ran the story in Forest and Stream. He was in contact with everybody he knew who might be able to wake up, the sleeping giant, the American public, and make them care about this. And he succeeded.
Within a week, legislation was working its way through Congress, authorizing regulations that would finally protect the park, its geysers, and its wildlife. On May 7, 1894, less than 2 months after Howell's capture, President Grover Cleveland signed the bill into law.
George Bird Grinnell and Theodore Roosevelt and the other defenders of Yellowstone were thinking in ecosystem terms before anybody was using the term. They saw places like Yellowstone as reservoirs. They used the term reservoir. It was a reservoir for wildlife. I think if the opportunity presented by the capture of Hal had been missed, we would have lost the bison. They were so close to gone.
Gentlemen, why in heaven's name this haste? You have time enough. Why sacrifice the present to the future, fancying that you will be happier when your fields teem with wealth and your cities with people? In Europe, we have cities wealthier and more populous than yours, and we are not happy. You dream of your posterity, but your posterity will look back to yours as the golden age and envy those who first burst into this silent, splendid nature, who first lifted up their axes upon these tall trees and lined these waters with busy wharves. Why then seek to complete in a few decades what took the other nations of the world thousands of years? Why your hurry of splendid gifts? You have opportunities such as mankind has never had before. Lord James Bryce.
The first duty of the human race is to control the earth it lives upon. The first principle of conservation is development. The use of natural resources now existing on this continent for the benefit of the people who live here now. Gifford Pinchot.
Gifford Pinchot was a graduate of Yale who had studied forestry in Germany and France and returned as the first American to declare himself a professional forester. He and John Muir had met in 1896 and in the beginning enjoyed each other's company, camping together on the rim of the Grand Canyon. But while the two men agreed that America's forests were being rapaciously destroyed, they ultimately parted company on the solution. Muir considered forests sacred. He wanted them treated as parks, with logging, grazing, and hunting prohibited. Pinchot didn't agree. He wanted forests protected too, but he believed the best way to do it was to manage their use, not leave them alone. His favorite saying was the greatest good for the greatest number.
Much is said on questions of this kind about the greatest good for the greatest number. But the greatest number is too often found to be number one. It is never the greatest number in the common meaning of the term that makes the greatest noise and stir on questions mixed with money. Complaints are made in the name of poor settlers and miners, while the wealthy corporations are kept carefully hidden in the background. But as to these Goths and Vandals of the wilderness, who are spreading Black Death in the fairest woods God ever made, let the government up and at 'em.
We often tell stories about the origins of the American conservation by setting John Muir and Gifford Pinchot in counterpoint with each other. Often in those stories, John Muir is the hero and Gifford Pinchot is the villain. In fact, they represent, I think, two sides of one coin. Muir is the figure who celebrates the sacred in nature, the wildness, the otherness of nature, that which we need to protect if we are not to contaminate things that are not human with our own human agendas. Pinchot, on the other hand, is about a conservation that celebrates sustainability. It's about keeping the roots of our material lives in the natural world in such a way that we don't destroy nature as we use nature for our own livelihood.
Congress and the administration of President Grover Cleveland sided with Pinchot, who was appointed the nation's chief forester. National forests would become part of the Department of Agriculture, used and managed like a crop. But if Muir could not prevail on the future of all national forests, he tried to salvage at least a partial victory by protecting one forest as a national park. It was in western Washington state, within sight of the cities of Seattle and Tacoma, the ancient homeland of nearly a dozen Indian tribes, including the Cowlitz, Nisqually, Puyallup, and Yakima, who called it Tahoma, the big mountain where the waters begin. White settlers called it Mount Rainier.
Altogether, this is the richest subalpine garden. The icy dome needs none of man's care. But unless the reserve is guarded, the flower bloom will soon be killed.
Sierra Club, the national G99, Mount Rainier became the nation's 5th national park.
When on the streets I meet young girls and matrons with their kindly faces, and see the egrets in their bonnets and hats, I cannot help feeling that these daughters of Eve do not know on her nest. They would be ashamed to keep them, even in secret, much less to display them on the public street.
They're holding up signs, they're into it, they know the participants, they know the buyers, they know the makers. You have a lot of personalities.
Streets. John F. Lacey.
The ground for its most beautiful plumed birds was southern Florida, where the fresh waters of Lake Okeechobee drained slowly toward the marsh in the world, the Everglades. Great white and snowy egrets had become more valuable per ounce than gold, and nearly 95% of Florida's shorebirds had been killed by plume hunters. More than 5 million birds a year were perishing to satisfy the demand of the latest fashion trend, using bird feathers to decorate women's hats. Strolling the streets of New York for part of an afternoon, one ornithologist counted 542 feathered hats, representing 40 different species. Some hats included an entire stuffed bird.
Fashion decrees feathers, and feathers it is. This condition of affairs must be something of a shock to the leaders of the Audubon Society, who were sanguine enough to believe that the moral idea represented by their movement would be enough to influence society.
The Audubon Society had done its best to try to persuade women not to buy such hats, even promoted the sale of featherless hats. It didn't work, and the millinery industry, based principally in New York City, used its influence in Congress to defeat a series of national laws aimed at stopping the slaughter. Then, an unlikely champion stepped forward.
We have a wireless telegraph, a thornless cactus, a seedless orange, and a coreless apple. Let us now have a birdless hat. John F. Lacey.
As the Republican Party began fracturing at the start of the 20th century into a progressive wing and a group of die-hard conservatives known as stand-pat Republicans, Representative John F. Lacey of Oskaloosa, Iowa, counted himself with those opposed to change. But when it came to defending wildlife or saving America's remaining unspoiled, but in the vanguard of even the most progressive politicians of the day.
The first settlers found this continent a storehouse content with using these resources. We have wasted them as reckless prodigals. For more than 300 years, destruction was called improvement of the resources of nature, or the world will at no distant day become as barren as a sucked orange.
It had been Lacey, working with George Bird Grinnell and Theodore Roosevelt, who pushed through the bill that finally gave government officials the tools they needed to protect America's last wild buffalo herd in Yellowstone. Now, after years of ceaseless effort, he won passage of another landmark, the Lacey Bird and Game Act of 19. But the Lacey Act did not put an end to plume hunting entirely, especially in the lawless Everglades. 5 years after the bill's passage, the game warden was murdered by poachers. 3 years after that, another one was gunned down. Some people began thinking that the uniquely abundant array of wildlife in southern Florida would never be safe unless the Everglades itself was set aside, like Yellowstone, as a national park.
The attempt to preserve and restore some of the wildlife of America is no longer looked upon as a fad or idle sentiment. We have given an awful exhibition of slaughter and destruction, which may serve as a warning to all mankind. Let us now give an example of wise conservation of what remains.
Conservation had crept into the nation's vocabulary. Now, a new president would turn the word into a movement.
Like all Americans, I like big things. Big prairies, big forests and mountains, big wheat fields, railroads, and herds of cattle, too. Big factories, steamboats, and everything else.
I think it's hard to accept the rise in the White House that sets in motion most of the conservation agendas that will define
Speaker and enjoyed leading the country. He was a person who turned the country in a different direction where conservation was concerned.
In the spring of 1903, Theodore Roosevelt once again boarded a train headed west. On April 8th, he stepped off at the Northern Pacific Railroad terminal. He was no longer the scrawny and inexperienced Easterner cowboys had laughed at and called Four Eyes 20 years earlier. He was a national hero, the leader of the Rough Riders in the war with Spain, a former governor of New York State, President William McKinley's running mate in 1900, and now, following McKinley's assassination in 1901, the youngest president in United States history.
when somebody came in and said, there are bighorn sheep out there and they're coming down this cliff. So Roosevelt said, by Godfrey, I have to see that. And he jumps up with half of his face clean shaven and the other half full of lather and runs out into nature to see the bighorn sheep.
Park's interior, still covered in some places by up to 6 feet of snow. He saw the Norris Geyser Basin and Old Faithful, Canyon of the Yellowstone. But these wonders held only passing interest to him compared to the park's wildlife. In addition to the larger animals, he recorded sightings of pine squirrels and snowshoe hares and scores of different birds, including a pygmy owl, the first he had ever big game.
At one point, Roosevelt sees a mouse that he thinks is new to science, so he jumps off this sleigh and grabs it with his hand and kills it and then stuffs it.
It was done as neatly as a professed taxidermist would have done it. This was the only game the president killed in the park. John Burroughs.
Like the guy from Cheers? That's James Harper.
On April 24th, at the end of Roosevelt's visit, the entire population of the town of Gardner, Montana, gathered at the park's north entrance for a special ceremony. A new arch to welcome visitors to Yellowstone was under construction, and the president had agreed to speak at the laying of the arch's cornerstone. For the occasion, Roosevelt reluctantly changed out of his camping clothes, put on a business suit, and rode through town to the waiting crowd. He watched as the cornerstone was carefully put into place, then climbed to a rough platform on the stonework of the incomplete pillar and began to speak.
The Yellowstone Park is something absolutely unique in the world so far as I know. The scheme of its preservation is noteworthy in its essential democracy. The only way that the people as a whole can secure to themselves and their children the enjoyment in perpetuity of what the Yellowstone Park has to give is by assuming ownership in the name of the nation and jealously safeguarding and preserving the scenery, the forests, and the wild creatures.
Roosevelt argued that the parks are a democratic experience. That was his essential argument about the national parks. That the rich people always have their playgrounds, they know how to amuse themselves, and that America as a classless society, or at least a society that would like to be classless, needs to have places where regular human beings can go and stand side by side with the rich and privileged and enjoy the same experience and not be made to feel that they are somehow less. And so his primary argument was that the national parks are a democratic experiment in nature.
Before he got back on the train to resume his trip, Roosevelt had deliberately quoted from the act of Congress that had made Yellowstone the world's first national park, for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. Later, when the arch was finally completed, that phrase would be permanently carved into its mantle, so that everyone who entered Yellowstone knew why the park was there, and for whom.
The bus right outside the north entrance where there's that wonderful stone arch that says, for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. It doesn't say for the benefit and enjoyment of some of the people or a few of the people. It says all of the people. And for me, that meant democracy. And for me, that meant I was welcome. And I stepped outside. And as I was stepping down under the ground, there was a bison, a 2,000-pound animal walking by. And there was no one else around. The bison was just strolling by. And I looked up at the driver and I said, does this happen all the time? And he looked at me and said, all the time. And I said to myself, I've arrived. And I can't imagine not being in any other place. And to be honest with you, once I stepped off that bus, I never got back on.
2 weeks after leaving Yellowstone, Roosevelt's whirlwind tour brought him to Arizona's Grand Canyon for a brief stop on the way from New Mexico to Southern California. Roosevelt had never before seen the Grand Canyon, and he was overwhelmed by the vista from the South Rim. He longed to spend more time there, but his schedule permitted only this quick visit and a few remarks to the crowd that had gathered to greet him.
I want to ask you to do one thing in connection with it, in your own interest and in the interest of the country. Keep this great wonder of nature as it now is. Leave it as it is. You cannot improve it, only mar it. What you can do is to keep it for your children, your children's children, and for all who come after you, if he can travel at all, should see.
The great statement in the speech is, leave it as it is. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it. Nothing has ever been said about it is when you look at it and you see nothing that humans have constructed. It's a magnificent thing that he said, and if that were the one wilderness statement of American life, I believe it's greater than Thoreau. I believe that it's greater than John Muir. Leave it as it is. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it. should be the motto in front of every national park in the country. And if you think that this was said by a man on a 14,000-mile trip in which he gave 262 speeches, more or less off the top of his head on seeing the Grand Canyon for the first time, you realize what presidential greatness can be.
Then Roosevelt was gone. By the next day, he was whistle-stopping his way through California, giving 2 to 3 speeches a day, attending banquets and dinners in his honor, presiding at dedications and groundbreakings, setting the frenetic pace that had become his hallmark.
Nothing can be done well at a speed of 40 miles a day. Far more time should be taken. Walk away quietly in any direction and taste the freedom of the mountaineer. Climb the mountains and get their good tidings. Nature's peace will flow into you as sunshine flows drop off like autumn leaves.
By 1903, John Muir was 65 and more famous than ever. Mountain peaks and canyons, campsites and glaciers now bore his name. Magazine editors besieged him with requests for articles. The Sierra Club he had founded was growing steadily, and the hikes he personally led into the mountains were always the club's most heavily attended. People loved to hear him preach his deeply held gospel that salvation could be found through immersion in the natural world.
John Muir was there, mounted on the horse which he rode now and then, when no woman would accept the loan of it. He was rapt, entranced. He threw up his arms in a grand gesture. This was the morning of creation, he cried. The whole thing is beginning now. The mountains are singing together.
No one can present all identity theft or monitor all transactions and all businesses. LifeLock by North, 5% off.
For nearly a decade now, he had been struggling to have the Yosemite Valley given back to the federal government and made part of the larger Yosemite National Park. But nothing he seemed to say or
Call our one line at 833-317-4673 or live chat at calhost.org. Attention Bachelor Nation, he's back. The host of some of America's most dramatic TV moments returns with the most dramatic podcast ever with Chris Harrison. During 2 decades of reality TV, Chris saw it all, and now he's telling it all.
had proven successful. Things remained at a standstill in the spring of 1903 as Muir prepared to leave his home in
Podcast ever with Chris Harrison on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you get your podcasts. Heart failure, carpal tunnel syndrome,
California and embark on a trip to Europe and Asia with some friends.
If you have heart failure and any of those seemingly unrelated symptoms sound familiar, it's time to talk with your cardiologist and get the full picture. They may have to transthyretin amyloid cardiomyopathy. ATTRCM is a rare and underdiagnosed disease. Recognize the signs and discuss them with your doctor soon. Learn more at connectwithyourheart.com.
Suddenly, his plans changed.
An influential man from Washington wants to make a trip into the Sierra with me and around the campfire.
It was the president, still working his way up through California, asking Muir to accompany him during a visit to Yosemite. I do not want anyone with me but you, Roosevelt had written. I want to drop politics absolutely and just be out in the open with you. Muir realized this was the opportunity of a lifetime. He purchased a brand new woolen suit for the occasion and hurried to join the presidential entourage. On May 15th, they set off for the Mariposa Grove of big trees in a flurry of activity. a long caravan of wagons filled with staff and dignitaries, a detachment of 30 Buffalo President's coach, along with the Governor of California, the Secretary of the Navy, the Surgeon General, 2 college presidents, and Roosevelt's personal secretary. It was hardly the trip he had been promised, but Muir tried his best to squeeze in words to the president and governor about the issue of making all of Yosemite a national park. In the grove of mighty sequoias, the president's group paused, as all tourists did, for a snapshot at the famous Wawona tunnel tree. And later, they posed for an official photograph, lined up along the base of the grizzly giant, the oldest and most famous sequoia in Yosemite, estimated to be 2,000, that was 6.5 feet in diameter. Then the troops, the phalanx of reporters and photographers, and virtually all of the official party headed back to the Wawona Hotel, where a series of receptions that evening. None of them knew that Roosevelt had no intention of attending. Instead, a plan Roosevelt had hatched to allow him time alone with the trees and the man who considered them sacred. They built a fire and sat around it, low of the blaze.
The night was clear, and in the darkening aisles of the great sequoia grove, the rose round us like the pillars of a mightier cathedral than ever was conceived, even by the fervor of the Middle Ages. Hermit thrushes sang beautifully in the evening.
And Muir said, I fell in love with this Theodore Roosevelt. He actually used those words. You can't resist this man. I fell in love with him. Roosevelt, interestingly enough, came back and complained a little bit about Muir and said he doesn't know his bird songs. Muir also got one off on Roosevelt. He said to him, Mr. President, when are you going to get over this infantile need you have to kill animals? Roosevelt would not have taken that from any other human being.
I had a perfectly glorious time with the president and the mountains. I never before had a more interesting, hearty, and manly companion. I stuffed him pretty well regarding the timber thieves and other spoilers of the forest.
Long after sundown, with no tent and only a pile of army blankets, the 2 men finally went to sleep. The next morning at 6:30, they saddled up for the long ride to Yosemite Valley, with the guide under strict orders from the president to avoid at all costs the Wawona Hotel and the delegation of officials he had jilted the night before. In the high country near Glacier Point, with its spectacular panorama of the valley and its waterfalls arrayed at their feet, they stopped and once more made camp at a spot their guide, Charlie Leidig, had picked out.
Around the campfire, Roosevelt and Muir talked far into the night regarding Muir's glacial theory of the formation of Yosemite Valley. They also talked a great deal about the protection of forests in general in Yosemite, discussing the setting aside of other areas, because both men wanted to do the talking.
They awoke the next morning, covered by a light snow that had fallen in the high country during the night. Rather than feeling inconvenienced, the president couldn't have been more delighted. We slept in a snowstorm last night, he exclaimed to the crowds that had been patiently waiting for him on the valley floor. This, he said, has been the grandest day of my life. After camping one more night alone with Muir, the president was picked up and escorted back to the train station for the resumption of his cross-country tour. And when he spoke at the state capitol in Sacramento a day later, Roosevelt's words sounded as if they could have come from the lips of John Muir.
Lying out at night under those sequoias was lying in a temple built by no hand of man. A temple grander than any human architect could by any possibility build. And I hope for the preservation of the groves of giant trees, simply because it would be a shame to our civilization to let them disappear. They are monuments in themselves. I want them preserved. We are not building this country of ours for a day. It is to last through the ages.
California Legislature and United States Congress approved the transfer of the Yosemite Valley and Mariposa Big Trees back to the federal government.
I am now an experienced lobbyist. My political education is complete. Have attended the legislature, made speeches, explained, exhorted, persuaded every mother's son of the legislators, newspaper reporters, and everybody else who would listen to me. And now that the fight is finished, and my education as a politician and lobbyist is finished, I am almost finished myself.
Yosemite National Park now encompassed almost everything Muir had been fighting for. Sound the timbrel, he wrote a friend, and let every Yosemite tree and stream rejoice.
I remember one day I was walking in the Cook's Meadow, which is a meadow in the central part of Yosemite Valley, and there was a woman there, and she was just looking up and around her, and she just kept saying, "Oh, oh my, oh my." I went up to her and said, "Ma'am, are you all right?" She said, "Yes, I'm just fine. I didn't have to talk to her about the transcendent experience. She was having one, and it wasn't a transcendent experience because it was a national park. It was transcendent because it was Yosemite Valley. But because it had become a national park, she could have that transcendent experience. An experience like that.
In other parts of the world, there are certain areas that are preserved because some rich noble tree it. But in the United States, you don't have to be dependent on some rich guy being generous to you. To me, that's what national parks mean. It's a symbol of democracy. Democracy when it works well, at its best.
Back in 1870, a 15-year-old boy in Kansas was idly reading the newspaper that had been used to wrap his lunch. He came across an article about a mysterious sunken lake in Oregon, and he vowed to visit it one day. It would take William Gladstone Steele 15 years to get there.
Imagine a vast mountain 6 by 7 miles through, at an elevation of 8,000 feet, with the top removed and the inside hollowed out, then filled with presentation of Crater Lake.
When a volcanic eruption, witnessed by the ancestors of the Klamath Indians, blew the top off a mountain peak in the Cascades, the result was Crater Lake, at 1,942 feet, the deepest lake in America. Because it is filled almost entirely by snowfall, the lake is also the world's clearest. An 8-inch disc, lowered into its sky blue waters, is still visible 142 feet below the surface. William Steele resolved that it should be protected forever, just like Yellowstone and the other.
And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. Uri Geller, the world's most investigated and celebrated mystery. He is famous around the planet for his mind-bending FBI, CIA. He's an accomplished author as well. And here he is, one of our favorite guests, back on Coast to Coast, Uri Geller. Hello, Mr. Geller. Welcome back.
parks. That quest took him another 17 years of tireless promotion and lobbying before he finally succeeded in 1908 National Park. And it had all happened because of his accidental lunchtime reading 32 years earlier.
The parks, they're the greatest spots on earth. Wonderful natural places. But the story of national parks really isn't a story about the place. It's the story of people who fell in love with those places. People who became so devoted to them that they wanted to do anything they could to save them.
Richard Wetherell. He's broadening out from Mesa Verde. He wants to make people aware that we have such a treasure, such a heritage here. And yet, here's this cowboy. A cowboy, and we all know what cowboys are. We reading our dime novels. They can't be doing anything scholarly.
Despite his lack of formal education, Richard Wetherell wanted to be taken seriously as an archaeologist. He had left Mesa Verde and began scouring the Southwest in search of other ruins. His journey took him from Colorado to Utah and Arizona, and finally to New Mexico, to a place called Chaco Canyon, another eerily silent set of ruins left behind by the ancient Puebloans. With walls of remarkable workmanship, some rising 5 stories, Pueblo Bonito, the biggest ruin, contained remnants of an enclosed plaza, 35 circular kivas, more than 2 acres honeycombed by 650 rooms, connected by small passageways and doors. The religious and cultural hub of the civilization that had dominated the surrounding region between 850 and 1200 AD. By itself, Pueblo Bonito was several times larger than anything at Mesa Verde, and it sat in the midst of an array of nearly a dozen other significant ruins. Wetherell moved there with his wife Marietta, filed a homestead claim, and hired nearly 100 Navajos to help him with the excavations.
Navajo.
Though Wetherell tried to carry on his work as carefully and scientifically as possible, professional archaeologists still dismissed him as a pot hunter. And as the relics he was unearthing reached Eastern museums, 50,000 pieces of turquoise, 10,000 pieces of pottery, 5,000 stone implements, and much more, they clamored for the government to do something to stop him.
Richard Wetherell was very careful, identifying everything he found. He was ahead of the professional archaeologists, which is an oxymoron at that time, but he was ahead of them, and I think they were jealous of him. There's a snobbishness. Educated Easterners can't believe that a Western cowboy could possibly be doing these things.
For his part, Wetherell said he would gladly turn over any portions of Chaco Canyon if the federal government would simply do something to protect them. But the criticism of Wetherell's work would not go away. Meanwhile, back at Mesa Verde, the ruins Wetherell had first discovered were in danger. Thieves, pot hunters, and tourists were flocking to the site, looting the artifacts, damaging the ancient structures, sometimes even setting off sticks of dynamite simply to frighten away the rattlesnakes. Now, a new group had taken up the cause of protecting its treasures.
Mesa Verde seems to be set apart for a park, and to make and keep it as such is the aim of the Colorado Cliff Dwellings Association of Women. Virginia McClurg.
Virginia McClurg was a well-known lecturer with a seemingly boundless determination to leave her mark on the world. She gathered a group of women into the Colorado Cliff Dwellings Association organized petitions, wrote personal letters to the president, held rummage sales, and solicited 10-cent contributions from other women's groups across the country. And it was working. Support for protecting Mesa Verde had become a national cause. But just when Congress seemed ready to act, it became clear to those around her that Virginia McClurg had a different vision of how Mesa Verde should be preserved.
I do not see why this small and compact tract in the proposed park should not be under the protective care of a body of 125 women with hereditary membership who know more about the matter and care more about the matter than anyone else.
Virginia became so engrossed in it that it suddenly was not our park as a nation, it was her park.
Twice, McClurg even negotiated leases between her group and the Ute Indians, only to have the federal government remind her that private citizens cannot make treaties. The uproar she created threatened to derail the bill in Congress at the very moment it seemed headed for passage. Even some of her closest allies now suspected that Virginia McClurg had lost sight of the real goal. Lucy Peabody, the association's vice regent, had preferred to get results rather than grab head for future generations, and now felt compelled to resign from the association. With her went many other members, including some of the group's most McClurg, once the darling of the press, found herself disparaged in newspaper editorials.
There was a sadness about this. At the moment of your greatest achievement, you lose it. So possessive with her that to have it within your grasp, right there, and it's gone.
On June 29, 1906, the National Park, the first of its kind, meant to celebrate not majestic natural scenery, but a prehistoric culture and its people. With Mesa Verde protected, anger over Richard Wetherill's excavations at Chaco Canyon in New Mexico boiled over and set in motion events that would change the course of park history.
The bill for Mesa Verde was just for Mesa Verde, but what about the other ruins?
Dear and nothing like his native Iowa. He sponsored a new bill to make any unauthorized disturbance of any prehistoric ruin a federal crime. The Act for the Preservation of American Antiquities also granted the President of the United States an extraordinary power. The exclusive authority, without any congressional approval, to set aside places that would be.
John F. Lacey gave the president the greatest power the president could ever have for the preservation of nature, which allowed the president to do something as simple as pick up a pen and declare an area of the public domain a national monument. And since Teddy Roosevelt happened to be the president at the time, was that a gay Roosevelt picked up that pen and started creating national monuments, and the country would never be the same again.
Roosevelt quickly put his new powers to use. He proclaimed the first national monument, a unique mass of grooved rock, sacred to several Indian tribes, rising nearly 900 feet above the plains of eastern Wyoming. It was called Devil's Tower.
This is oh my God.
Then he named El Morro
Jesus
National
Christ.
Monument
This
in
is
New
all I
Mexico,
needed. I didn't need
a
to
rock
fucking
abutment
kick
bearing prehistoric
later,
Indian
whenever you
petroglyphs,
consider this,
as well as the inscriptions of early Spanish expeditions that had come north from Mexico 300 years earlier and founded a colony 15 years before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. And on March 11, 1907, he did exactly what Richard Wetherill had wanted and created Chaco Canyon National Monument. Roosevelt would also use the Antiquities Act to protect an endangered grove of coastal redwoods north of San Francisco, named in honor of the man who had first introduced Roosevelt to the giant trees, Muir Woods.
The man of science, the naturalist, too often loses sight of the essential oneness of all living beings in seeking to classify them in kingdoms, orders, species, etc. While the eye of the poet, the seer, never closes on the kinship of all God's creatures, and his heart ever beats in sympathy with great and small alike, as earthborn companions and fellow mortals, equally.
God damn it, is it good?
And he buried her next to her parents near an orchard on their farm. President Roosevelt, who had lost his first wife as a young man and then found solace in the open spaces of the West, sent his personal condolences. "Get out among the mountains and trees, friend," he wrote. "They will do more for you than either man or woman could." But the aging mountaineer went instead to the deserts of Arizona, where it was hoped his daughter Helen might recover from pneumonia. In his grief, he began exploring the surrounding area and discovered that in fact he was once again in a majestic forest. Only this one was 200 million years old, and all of the trees had long ago fossilized into solid rock. It was the petrified forest.
I think parks represent the wildness inside us. They're the place where we can be lonely, where we can experience solitude. They're a place we go to as refuge, as sanctuary. It's the place we go out to come back in. It's the only place, perhaps.
Soon Muir was himself again, sometimes taking total strangers on long walks through the tumbled and broken stone trees. In what he now called these enchanted carboniferous forests, he loved nothing more than to sit near the trunk of a petrified tree and inspect it minutely with a magnifying in hopes of finding amethyst crystals inside them. Boxcar loads of petrified wood were being shipped east to be made into tabletops and mantelpieces. An enormous stone crusher was being constructed to pulverize the logs for use as industrial abrasives. For years, John F. Lacey, but John Muir knew somebody who now could save his enchanted forest with a stroke of his pen. President Roosevelt invoked the Antiquities Act again, and Petrified Forest National Monument was created.
There is nothing more practical than the preservation of beauty, than the preservation of anything that appeals to the higher. I believe we are past the stage of national existence when we could look on complacently at the individual who skimmed the land himself to leave a desert.
If government doesn't protect the weakest elements of humanity and the weakest elements of nature, the whole game is lost. That was an incredible breakthrough for a man who grew up in a profoundly Republican household in an age of J.P. Morgan and John Rockefeller. There's a paradox at the very center of American life. We are meant to be the most materially happy, wealthiest, most privileged people who ever lived on earth. That's one version of the American dream. But we are also Thoreau's Americans and Jefferson's Americans and Roosevelt's Grand Canyon Americans. And we want that. And somehow we've gotten it into our heads that we can have both. And maybe, but Roosevelt understood that's the key.
We used to talk about Teddy Roosevelt having distance in his eyes. And that's what's important, is to have this. And
so the people can understand it and appreciate it.
Before his presidency was over, he would create 5 new national parks, 51 federal bird sanctuaries, 4 national game refuges, 18 national monuments, and more than 100 million acres worth of national forests. Roosevelt wanted one more national park added to his list. The place he had urged the citizens of Arizona to leave as it is, the grandest canyon on earth. Miners were filing claims, and ranchers were grazing cattle all along the South Rim. But even Theodore Roosevelt could not persuade Congress to act. Local sentiment and vested interests were just too powerful. The president looked for some way, any way, to prevent the canyon from becoming another commercialized Niagara Falls.
It was written basically to try to prevent the destruction of Indian archaeological sites in the American Southwest. The idea being that there were people going in and robbing these graves, and that needed to be stopped. And so a law is written that says that other than archaeology, and the great beneficiary of that law would be the Grand Canyon.
The wording of the Antiquities Act referred to protection of so-called objects of historic and scientific interest. And though it had contemplated only small-sized parcels, up to then no more than 5,000 acres, it did not absolutely restrict the number of acres a president could set aside. On January 11th, 1908, declaring the Grand Canyon an object of unusual scientific interest, being the greatest eroded canyon within the United States, Roosevelt set aside 806,400 acres as a national monument. It would not enjoy the same protections as a national park, but it was a step in the right direction. Politicians in Arizona were outraged and threatened to challenge Roosevelt in court. Members of Congress complained that the president had overstepped his authority. He ignored them all.
A lot of Westerners, powerful Westerners, congressmen, senators were opposed and critical. And that was part of Teddy Roosevelt's power, that he could overwhelm the wishes of local people and dared to do it.
Well, there was furor. There is always furor when these things happen, short term. But Roosevelt understood that short-term controversy over nature leads to long-term benefit. Roosevelt's view was that an intact environment is infinitely more valuable spiritually and economically than an extracted one.
But today, who would say the Grand Canyon was a mistake?
I had numerous infections. My hair was falling out all over the furniture. My legs were falling up out of
The very first reservation that ever was made in this world, the Garden of Eden, contained only one tree, the smallest reservation that ever was made. Yet, no sooner was it made than it was attacked by everybody in the world. The devil, one woman, and one man. This has been the history of every reservation that has been made since that time. That is, as soon as a reservation is once created, then the thieves and the devil and his relations come forward to attack it. John Muir.
He said nothing tolerable is safe. And it's like this insight into human beings, but particularly Americans. He understood this relentless grasp of American commerce that wants to reach into everything. And he realized that if a dollar value could be attached to, in his mind, a sacred place, it was vulnerable.
Since the start of the 20th century, the city of San Francisco had been looking for a better supply of water to fuel its growth. and it had set its sights on the Tuolumne River and the Hetch Hetchy Valley as the perfect place for a dam and reservoir. A narrow valley, remote enough to assure that the waters trapped from the yearly Sierra runoff would stay pure. The fact that it was within the boundaries of Yosemite National Park only added to its attractiveness to city planners. No competing claims to water rights existed. The only landowner to deal with was the federal government. Damming and flooding Hetch Hetchy would be cheaper and easier than finding alternative sites.
That anyone would try to destroy such a place seems incredible. But sad experience shows that there are people good enough and bad enough for anything.
To John Muir, allowing a dam in any national park would betray the very purpose of parks, and even worse in his eyes, set a dangerous precedent for the future. Hetch Hetchy was among his favorite places in Yosemite. He called it one of nature's rarest and most precious mountain temples. With its own majestic waterfalls and massive granite faces, it had all the beauty of the more famous Yosemite Valley 20 miles to the south, he said, without the clutter of tourist hotels. When he had helped draw the boundary lines for the national park back in 1890, he had been
devotees of ravaging commercialism seem to have a perfect contempt for nature, and instead of lifting their eyes to the god of the mountains, lift them to the almighty dollar. Damn Hetch Hetchy. As well damn for water tanks the people's cathedrals and churches. For no holier temple has ever been consecrated by the heart of man.
At first, Muir's view had prevailed. Theodore Roosevelt's Interior Secretary turned down San Francisco's application 3 different times. Then on April 18, 1906, a tremendous earthquake had shaken San Francisco, bringing down hundreds of buildings and igniting fires that consumed most of the city, killing thousands. With San Francisco reduced to ashes, politicians redoubled their efforts for a reservoir at Hetch Hetchy, claiming falsely that its water supply could have prevented the destruction. In a referendum, San Franciscans voted 7-1 in favor of the dam. The city's mayor launched a campaign attacking Muir's character for trying to obstruct the project. Even Muir's own Sierra Club split over the issue, with some prominent members advocating the dam.
They loved Yosemite, but they loved Yosemite in a kind of additive way. It wasn't at the core of their understanding of America. And for them in San Francisco, the city came first.
Meanwhile, an old adversary of Muir's stepped forward on the city's behalf, Gifford Pinchot. As the nation's top forester and President Roosevelt's trusted advisor, Pinchot had become one of the most powerful men in Washington. At his urging, Roosevelt had reserved millions of acres of western land as national forests in the face of congressional opposition. Pinchot steadfastly believed that conservation meant wise use of nature, not preserving it for its own sake. And he had never been a wholehearted supporter of national parks, expanding them. When a new Interior Secretary joined the administration, Pinchot began lobbying him in support of the dam. In response, Muir once again took his case to the man with whom he had shared 3 magical nights in the park back in 1903, the outdoorsman he considered a friend and kindred spirit.
The few promoters of the present scheme all show forth a proud set of confidence that comes from a good, sound, substantial, irrefragable ignorance. Hetch Hetchy is one of the most sublime and beautiful and important features of the park, and to dam and submerge it would be hardly less destructive and deplorable than would be the damning of Yosemite itself. Faithfully and devotedly yours, John Muir.
My dear Mr. Muir, Pinchot is rather favorable to the Hetch Hetchy plan. I have sent him your letter with a request for a report on it. I will do everything in my power to protect not only the Yosemite, which we have already protected, but other similar great natural beauties of this country. But you must remember that it is out of the question permanently to protect them unless we have a certain degree of friendliness toward them on the part of the people of the state in which they are situated.
What makes the conflict between Muir and Pinchot so good, both of which are worth celebrating, are on a collision course. For one man, Muir, that valley and that park are a cathedral, and anything that might desecrate that cathedral is blasphemy. It is a sources for democracy.
But Pinchot was in Washington, and Muir was in California. Pinchot's view prevailed. Pending congressional approval, the Interior Secretary granted San Francisco's application, calling it the greatest benefit to the greatest number of people. President Roosevelt did nothing to stop it. Muir was devastated. But the fight was not over. A year later, with Roosevelt out of the White House, the new president, William Howard Taft, came to California on his own tour of Yosemite, and to the dismay of San Francisco's politicians, chose Muir as his guide. Before the visit was over, Taft decided to oppose the dam. His Secretary of the Interior, Franklin K. Lane, the former city attorney for San Francisco. Lane wasted no time getting the project back on track. Muir was now 75, and the long battle over Hetch Hetchy had taken its toll. 10 years earlier, he had anticipated completing 20 books in his old age. Because of what he called this everlasting Hetch Hetchy business, he had managed to finish only 2. I wonder, he wrote his daughter, if leaves feel lonely when they see their neighbors falling. Still, he soldiered on, speaking, writing, urging anyone who would listen not to flood the exquisite valley. I still think we can win, Muir said in November of 1913, adding, anyhow, I'll be relieved when it's settled, for it's killing me. 3 weeks later, the bill approving the dam cleared its final hurdle in Congress. President Wilson quickly signed it into law.
It was sorrowful indeed to see him sitting in his cobwebbed study in his lonely house, with the full force of his defeat upon him after the struggle of a lifetime in the service of Hetch Hetchy. I could not but think that if Congress man had gone away, and I fear that is going to be very soon, as he appeared to me to be breaking very fast. Robert Marshall.
Exhausted and frail, Muir forced himself to finish a book on his travels in Alaska. He built new bookcases in the big, empty house he had once shared with his wife Louie and their 2 children.
The battle for conservation will go on endlessly. It is part of the universal warfare between right and wrong. Fortunately, wrong cannot last. Soon or late, it must fall back home to Hades, while some compensating good must surely follow. There must be places for human beings to satisfy their souls. Food and drink is not all. There is the spiritual. In some, it is only a germ, of course. But the germ will grow.
In December of 1914, he came down with pneumonia. On Christmas Eve, John Muir, the wilderness prophet who had struggled so hard to get his adopted country to experience the blessings of nature, died.
I think when John Muir walked into Yosemite, a century-long conversation began. And it was a conversation about the nature of America and about whether we were going to remain what Lincoln called the last best hope of Earth, or whether we were simply going to become another Europe. And John Muir's encounter with Yosemite, remember, he was a European. He came from this narrow Scots background. He was not an American. And he encountered Yosemite and he imagined what America could be. And for a century, we fought about whether we liked his vision or not.
I like what he said on one occasion where he essentially said, the enemies of wildness are invincible and they are everywhere. But the fight must go on. And for every acre that you gain, 10,000 trees and flowers and all the other forest people and the usual unborn generations rise up and call you blessed.
4 years after Muir's death, work on the dam he had opposed with all his strength began. And the Hetch Hetchy Valley, whose tranquil meadows he had compared to a landscape garden and a mountain temple, would slowly be entombed under hundreds of feet of water. But Muir's fight had struck a chord in many Americans, who now wondered if a lovely valley in Yosemite National Park could be turned into a reservoir. Were any national parks safe?
John Muir lost the fight over Hetch Hetchy, and the dam was built, and people who live in San Francisco today drink the water of Hetch Hetchy. Muir died feeling that he'd been defeated by that, and it was a great tragedy at the end of his life. But it's also true that Hetch Hetchy would then go on across the 20th century as a kind of battle cry that would inform all wilderness, wildland, parkland battles from that moment on. It looks like a defeat, and yet what's interesting about it is that in that defeat, a whole series of people began to wonder whether the parks needed more protection than they currently had. That there needed to be some greater rampart, some greater wall that could defend the parks against a future such controversy.
A proposal that Muir had supported now began gaining greater ground across the nation to create an agency within the federal government whose sole job would be to promote, administer, and protect the national parks, to make sure they fulfilled their great promise and endured for countless generations.
Muir said, as long as I live, I'll hear the birds and the winds and the waterfalls sing. I'll interpret the rocks and learn the language of flood and storm and avalanche. I'll make the acquaintance of the wild gardens and the glaciers and get as near to the heart of this world as I could. And so I did. I sauntered about from rock to rock, from grove to grove, from stream to stream, and whenever I met a new plant, I would sit down beside it for a minute or a day to make its acquaintance, hear what it had to tell. I asked the boulders where they had been and whither they were going, and when night found me, there I camped. I took no more heed to save time or to make haste than did the trees or the stars. This is true freedom, a good, practical sort of immortality. I often wonder what man will do with the mountains. Will he cut down all the trees to make ships and houses? If so, what will be the final and far upshot? Will a better civilization come in accord with obvious nature? And all this wild beauty be set to human poetry and song? What is the human part of the mountain's destiny? John Muir.
Out of 2,000 adults surveyed, Most people on average only get 6 hours of sleep and only feel well rested 3 days a week. This means that they will aspire to get 24 more hours in 2023. The premier protein nutrition consultant says most people do not realize how their eating routine and daily habits impact sleep quality. Based on whether or not it's the 60s of the weekend, women met dilated speed of the AMIT, 40 and 50 for the desert, 31 in the 30s and 40s. Sunday will be the same across the Southland, tied to the 60s. And that's when one of 50 equal to 48 for March 49 or March 46 degrees. Even local, 2025, 24 hour weekend, this video is really good. Tell me, how can you know if it's a touchdown?
Yes, it's transcendent. Just as walking into a cathedral is transcendent. But what could be more cathedral in feel than Yosemite Valley or Grand Canyon? I mean, John Muir, I think he thought it was somewhat ironic that there's a chapel in Yosemite Valley because you're building a church in the greatest cathedral in America. And I think that when people go into these spaces, they find that they have enough spirit that they can fill the space and they can be filled by those spaces.
By 1914, the national park idea had expanded beyond Yellowstone and Yosemite, where the notion of setting aside special places for all Americans had first taken root half a century earlier. Parks could now be found surrounding snow-capped Mount Rainier in the Pacific Northwest, at the ancient cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde in the southwestern deserts, within the dark caverns of South Dakota's Wind Cave, in the reflection of the deep blue waters of Crater Lake in Oregon, and at half a dozen other locations the nation had decided to preserve, usually at the urging of individual Americans willing to turn their passion for a particular landscape into a crusade.
What's happening is that people are identifying interesting places that look like they're under some kind of threat or look like they might be worth preserving, and a law gets written, a park gets created, and boom, it's added to this set. But the set is not a system. The set has no coherence to it. There are no regular rules for governing all. It's pretty chaotic in here.
The departments of Agriculture, Interior, and War each claimed some responsibility for the parks. But in truth, no one was in charge. Nothing proved it more than the fact that the city of San Francisco had been given permission to construct a dam in Yosemite's Hetch Hetchy Valley and submerge a scenic wonder under a massive water reservoir.
Hetch Hetchy was a crucial valley was lost. A beautiful valley was lost. It was a pebble that dropped in everybody's pool to make them ask, what future do we want? Do we want there to be some places where you go where things aren't necessarily convenient and we don't measure all of the greatness of the United States in a ledger book?
The battle over Hetch Hetchy had been the last for John Muir, the mountain prophet who had done so much to save the remaining vestiges of pristine America. Now, an unlikely alliance would carry on in his name and in his spirit. Railroad barons who saw in the parks a chance to increase their profits, as well as some of the nation's wealthiest men, who at a time when the disparities their fortunes to advance the public good. The national park idea was nearly 50 years old, but some of the nation's most spectacular landscape extractive energies that 20th century America possessed in such abundance. Special places in every corner of America were threatened. Volcanic islands in the Pacific were the most elemental, the continent's highest mountain, rising from the tundra of Alaska, the nation's most remote territory. And in the deserts of Arizona, a mile-deep gash in the earth, a canyon of equally indescribable immensity and beauty. In John Muir's absence, a new leader would step forward, an impulsive and seemingly self-confident businessman who would promote the parks as never before, and then struggle to bring them under a single management. Where Muir had changed things with his words, he would do it with his wealth and connections. Where Muir had emphasized the ecstatic, he would emphasize the economic and patriotic. But even more than John Muir, Stephen Mather had his own intense,
our best idea, but our highest ideal. I think that every time we walk into a national park, we make vows. We make vows that we will live beyond ourselves. We make vows that we will not just care about short-term gains, but long-term vistas. We remember the sweetness of engagement, that this is the open space of democracy, the beginning of creation.
Not far from Long's Peak in Colorado, in the heart of the Rocky Mountains, was an inn, owned and operated by an aspiring nature writer named Enos Mills. Mills had first come to the Rockies from Kansas at age 14, on doctor's orders that without clean alpine air, he would not live to adulthood. 30 years later, he was still there, traipsing alone from one mountain peak to another, to have the Long's Peak region preserved, not for the rich or royalty, who for years had been buying up the surrounding area, but for everyone as a national park. For his inspiration, Mills credited John Muir. Iowa and a chance encounter with the famous man himself
so
that
funny.
had given Mills'
Anything
life
that
new purpose and direction.
It was
I
every
will
fucking
glory
frat
in your
guy,
success,
every
a
fucking
sick
cat,
and aging
every
Muir had written to
fucking.
Mills. Government is so slow to learn the value of parks. But as congressional hearings began, word arrived that John Muir had died. It will be a great courtesy to the memory of that grand old man, one person testified, if you gentlemen unanimously recommend creation of this park. Congress agreed. Enos Mills' dream came true.
What a dumbass idea.
Rocky Mountain National Park was finally established.
No, that's cool.
And for the rest of his life, Mills would be called the John Muir of the Rockies.
I'm the rock out on the rock out.
I remember one fall afternoon when I was 25, probably. I was in Rocky Mountain National Park, and I started walking. I started climbing up through the pine forest, and I thought, what would happen if I never turned back? What would happen if I just kept walking? Where would I end up? Where would this trail take me?
They were close in 2018.
Matches, no flash. I did turn back, but I still wonder what would happen if I hadn't turned back. We have, as yet, no national park system. The parks have just happened. Nowhere in official Washington can an inquirer find an office of the national parks or a desk devoted solely to their management. Uncle Sam has simply not waked up about his precious parks.
In the summer of 1914, a vacationing millionaire named Stephen Mather visited Sequoia and Yosemite National Parks in California and was disgusted by what he saw. With only the Army periodically policing the parks, hiking trails were in poor condition. Cattle could still be found grazing there, and speculators had managed to file claims on choice parcels of land, planning to log the sequoias that Mather believed should be protected forever. Mather dashed off an angry letter to an old college schoolmate, Franklin K. Lane, the Secretary of the Interior, whose standing among conservationists was already low, since Lane had personally approved construction of the Hetch Hetchy Dam.
Dear Steve, if you don't like the way the national parks are being run, why don't you come down to Washington and run them yourself?
Soon enough, Mather showed up in Lane's office and agreed to serve as one of his assistants, overseeing the national parks. A nationwide search could not have found a better man for the job. Tall and athletic, with prematurely white hair and piercing blue eyes, Mather possessed what reporters called incandescent enthusiasm and an 8-cylinder, 60-mile-per-hour sort of personality.
To describe Mr. Mather, one must roll all the matinee idols into one, and then put the red blood of a real man into him. He has the kindest of blue eyes, as clear and frank as a child's, but the mouth and chin of a man who has fought his way in life. Woman's Magazine.
Born in California to a family with deep patrician roots in New England, Mather had taken a job as a reporter for the New York Sun, and then moved on as a sales manager for the Pacific Coast Borax Company, where his special genius for promotion found a national outlet. He produced a flood of publicity by glamorizing the company's beginnings in California's Death Valley.
He took Death Valley and made it a romantic place. Took borax, this household material, gave it the romantic name 20 Mule Team Borax. He would write letters to magazines posing as a contented housewife, talking about how her life had been transformed by the use of borax.
Mather had quickly realized he could make more money working for himself and helped start a competing company. By 1914, at age 47, he was rich beyond belief and restless for a new challenge. Years earlier, during a climb up Mount Rainier, he had discovered that during the darkest moments of his life, time in the great outdoors seemed to calm his sometimes fragile nerves and revive his prodigious energies. And he counted as one of the highlights of his life Sequoia National Park. Mather told Secretary Lane he would work for him, but for only 1 year. He was assigned a legal assistant in the secretary's office, a fellow Californian and Berkeley graduate named Horace Albright, an earnest and ambitious young man who had a local YMCA. Like Mather and so many others, Albright had also been inspired by a personal encounter with John Muir. But much of his work so far had been spent responding to angry letters, protesting the decision to flood the Hetch Hetchy Valley.
I had to learn to counterfeit Lane's signature and sign letters in reply, trying to explain why the dam should be built. I hated this job, for I was in sympathy with the protests.
Albright had been intending to quit and return to California to practice law when Mather entered his life and persuaded him to stay for 1 more year.
I was knowledgeable about Washington, the Interior Department, and Congress. I was quite good at detail and administrative work, which he obviously hated, and a bit in awe of him.
Mather was a great conceptualizer, and Horace was a great implementer. They complemented each other like father, like son. I mean, he was the reverse side of the same coin.
After being sworn in, Mather's first action was to more than double Horace Albright's yearly pay, with $2,400 from his own pocket. Next, he hired Robert Sterling Yard, a gifted editor of the New York Herald, to begin churning out a flurry of publicity for the parks, luring Yard to Washington with the promise of $5,000 a year and a personal secretary, all of it paid for by Mather, not the government.
I could speak to all the millionaire industrialists who were developing the parks, namely the railroads.
preservationists themselves during the period argument that nobody goes here. Because the Hetch Hetchy Valley had only 2,000 visitors a year, the argument was used against it. It was said that only effeminate members of the Sierra Club camp in Hetch Hetchy Valley, but 500,000 people from San Francisco could get a drink out of it. Stephen Mather understands that if he doesn't get people in the parks, if he doesn't get 500,000 people visiting the park in his own right, he's going to lose out to the arguments when the dams and reservoirs come down the pike.
Mather wined and dined congressmen and senators, newspaper and magazine publishers, pushed through legislation that would allow private individuals to make gifts of land and money to the parks, and began making plans for a whirlwind inspection tour, his words barely keeping up with his mile-a-minute brain. I thanked my stars I was young, strong, and healthy. His energy would have killed someone who wasn't. Before 1915 ended, Mather and Albright would travel nearly 35,000 miles. In Colorado, they were there with Enos Mills and a crowd of 300 for the dedication of Rocky Mountain National Park. At Mount Rainier in Washington State, Mather decided the superintendent was a political hack and fired him on the spot. At Yosemite, he learned that the 56-mile-long Tioga Road, the only east-west road through the park, was still in private hands and it took again, putting up half of it from wealthy friends. Then he just as quickly gave it away to become part of the park forever. And during a brief visit with Horace Albright to the Grand Canyon, still only a national monument and still under the control of the Forest Service, Mather became convinced that it needed greater protection. Make this unbelievable wonder your next national park, he said.
It seemed impossible that every new national park appeared more spectacular than the last, or at least more unusual. As I stood gaping at the awesome beauty, Mather joined me. Neither of us spoke for some time. Then I heard him say, "Horace, what God-given opportunity has come our way to preserve wonders like these before us."
Mather invited a group of 15 influential Americans, prominent editors and publishers, politicians, leading businessmen and railroad builders, to join him for 2 weeks in the Sierra Nevada of California. He called it his Mather Mountain Party. And he paid for it all, from the newfangled air mattresses placed under their sleeping bags to a Chinese cook who brought along a sheet metal stove to prepare gourmet dinners. Breakfasts included fresh fruit, steak, eggs, sausages, and hot, freshly baked rolls. Suppers were capped off by English plum pudding with brandy sauce, all of it served on white linen tablecloths with fine silverware and china.
He had two concepts: press and the flesh. You gotta go meet them in person. Don't write to them. Go shake their hands. And secondly, go show it to them. Because you don't get anywhere just telling them about it. They got to experience it like you have. He made converts, and he took people, not the parishioners who were singing in the choir. He was bringing them to the parks and putting them in the choir.
Coming across a campsite littered with tin cans and paper, he got his wealthy friends to help pick up the mess. They spent a night at Redwood Meadow, just outside the boundary of Sequoia National Park. Amidst a privately owned stand of majestic trees Mather could not bear to think might be cut down. He bought the grove and donated it to the nation. Slowly, the group worked its way up the western flank of the Sierra, fishing, hiking, and swimming in cold mountain streams. Then the hardiest of the bunch decided to ascend Mount Whitney. At 14,494 feet, the tallest peak in the 48 states, from which they could survey the vast wilderness John Muir and now Mather wanted preserved. By the end of their 2 weeks in the outdoors, Albright said, everyone in the party looked like a caveman. But his boss had converted them all into disciples for his cause. And when they gathered for their last meal together, he sent them on their way with an exhortation.
Now I want you to know that our job is not over. It is just beginning. Remember that God has given us these beautiful lands, but none of this will mean anything unless we have a safe haven for these wilderness places. We must have a national park service. Every one of us must pull our oar, go out and spread the gospel.
He had met John Muir and he knew the ecstasy that Muir had talked about. He knew the healing power of nature, but he added to that this notion of patriotism. He called the parks vast schoolrooms of Americanism, that if you bring a person to a park, they will feel better about the nation, the American flag, and perhaps somewhat justly so. But he also saw it as a tool to help promote the parks and to get the political support he needed to do the things he wanted to do.
Steve in Albany, New York, or Ken George? Go ahead, Steven. Yeah, Ernie. Hey, ROTHSCHILD first.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steven.
Rabbi, the old man, came down from his home in the sun to help his people, the Blackfeet.
With my fingers. I wanted to clarify something.
When his work was done, he went up into the mountains, where he came to 2 lakes. There he said to himself, I believe I will go up on that highest mountain and change myself into stone. In the crevice in the mountain, he lay down, with just his face peeking out, and turned himself into a rock. He is still there, watching for people to come looking for him.
On the border of Montana and Canada, in the northern reaches of the Rockies, where glaciers could still be found sculpting and polishing mountains rising 10,000 feet into the sky, and alpine cascades tumble down to form more than 650 lakes, was Glacier National Park, established by Congress in 1910. For centuries, the Blackfeet Indians had claimed the land as their own. But during a mining boom that brought in swarms of prospectors, they had been pressured into signing a new treaty, giving up the mountain portion of their refuge.
Chief Mountain is my head. Now my head is cut off. My calf.
When you walk into any natural national park, you're walking into somebody's homeland. You're walking into somebody's house. You're walking into somebody's church. You're walking into somebody's place where they've lived since the time the Creator made it for them. And so you're walking into some place that has been utilized for generations upon generations in every form you can imagine. This was their homeland.
When Congress failed to appropriate adequate funds for Glacier National Park's administration, the Great Northern Railway felt free to treat the park as its own little mountain kingdom. From the very beginnings of the park movement, long before Stephen Mather burst upon the scene, railroad companies had been busily selling America's parks. More tourists riding the rails meant more money for them.
The railroads make scenery a national asset. They make scenery a national business. Every railroad tried to have a national park that would be its very own. So the Santa Fe develops the Grand Canyon and wants it to be a full-fledged national park. Northern Pacific's in Yellowstone. Union Pacific will come to West Yellowstone. Great Northern Railway will go to Glacier. Northern Pacific will also go out to Mount Rainier. The Great Northern Railway will follow it out to Mount Rainier. The Southern Pacific will develop Yosemite and Sequoia. Their land agents, their people, their passenger agents will be in the halls of Congress, cajoling Congress silently from the wings. Make national parks so we can have more tourists going to the national parks and have this new and wonderful industry.
On every Great Northern Railway brochure and timetable, on every company press release and billboard, 3 words for more than a decade, part of a promotional campaign aimed at a very specific audience, upper middle class white Americans, predominantly.
You want the views? We've got them in the Yosemite Valley. You want to see the architecture here? We've got it in the Grand Canyon. Why are you Americans going to Europe to spend your hard-earned dollars over there when you have the Alps right here in Glacier National Park? Spend your dollars at home. Be patriotic.
The Great Northern like to promote Glacier National Park as America's Switzerland. One broke out in Europe in 1914, closing off overseas travel. The railroads saw a golden opportunity. The Great Northern dispatched a group of Blackfeet Indians to tour the East. They camped in teepees on the roof of New York City's McAlpin Hotel, rode the subway, and visited the Brooklyn Bridge. Attracted huge crowds when they performed war dances at the annual Travel and Vacation Show. Everywhere they went, the press referred arriving passengers in full regalia, and they set up an array of teepees for those who wanted what the railroad called an authentic Western experience at 50 cents a night.
In the early days of the national parks, the Indians were brought back not as a people who would tell the story, but as somebody who can dance for the tourists, as somebody who can sing for the tourists, with their feathers, their markings on their faces, their buckskin outfits, their bells, their drums. They were expected to be the Indian, to sing, to dance, and to use the terms that the tourists would be using in those.
While some park purists worried that the railroads already wielded too much influence, Stephen Mather saw them as partners, not only to promote the parks, but to help him in his quest to create a separate park service.
If you think of Mather as sort of an acolyte of John Muir, but taking things into a new direction, he did remember from John Muir, nothing tolerable is safe. And so how do you make it safe? You make it tolerable by saying, okay, there is this sentimentality beyond spirituality. There's a dollar value to it. We've always had the railroads, and if we attach that to it, we can get chambers of commerce, and we can form this movement that will protect the parks. And what's interesting about it is, while he's pushing this sort of economic argument as far and as hard as he can, no one was an example of the healing power, the spiritual power, the rejuvenation of being in a national park more than Stephen Mather.
I turned my eyes upon the volcano again. For a mile and a half in front of us, and half a mile on either side, the floor of the abyss was magnificently illuminated, like the campfires of a great army far away. It looked like a colossal railroad map of the state of Massachusetts, done in chain lightning on a midnight sky. Imagine it. Imagine imagine a coal black sky shivered into a tangled network of angry fire. I thought it possible that its like had not been seen since the children of Israel wandered on their long march through the desert, over a path illuminated by the mysterious pillar of fire. And I was sure that I now had a vivid conception of what the majestic pillar of fire was like, which almost amounted to a revelation. The smell of sulfur is strong, but not unpleasant to a sinner. Mark Twain.
Back in 1866, a young newspaper reporter writing under the pen name Mark Twain had been among the first tourists to stay at the new Volcano House on the rim of Kilauea, an active volcano on Hawaii's Big Island, the home, according to native Hawaiians, of Pele, the goddess of destruction and creation. Twain's colorful descriptions helped launch his career and brought the island's attractions to the attention of thousands of Americans. Compared to the huge caldera of Kilauea with its lakes of fire, Twain wrote, Italy's Mount Vesuvius was just a soup kettle. The nearby Mauna Loa, also an active volcano, was even bigger, rising 56,000 feet from the bottom of the Pacific, 13,679 of them above sea level, the most massive mountain on Earth. And on the island of Maui was the dormant volcano called Haleakala, the House of the Sun. Twain climbed to its 10,000-foot summit, peered into its vast and desolate crater, and with his companions spent the afternoon idly pushing boulders off the edge, simply to watch them tumble thousands of feet to the crater's floor. It was magnificent sport, he wrote. We wore ourselves out at it. After camping on the crater's edge, they awoke early the next morning with a blanket of clouds far below their feet, stretching endlessly across the Pacific toward the rising sun.
I felt like the last man, neglected of the judgment, and left pinnacled in mid-heaven, a forgotten relic of a vanished world.
By 1960, 50 years after Twain's visit, tourists were now coming in ever greater numbers to gawk at Kilauea's fiery displays. As proof that they had been there, some would break off stalactites in the lava caves, or singe their postcards by extending them into the furnace-hot fissures. At Haleakala, the only place in the world where the distinctive silver sword plant grows, taking half a century to mature, so many visitors had gotten into the habit of carrying them off as souvenirs that the species was threatened with extinction. On August 1st, 1916, after more than a decade of lobbying by a coalition of naturalists and scientists, businessmen and boosters, and the enthusiastic support of Stephen Mather, Hawaii National Park was born. But Congress declined to appropriate any money for it, on the belief, one senator explained, that it should not cost anything to run a volcano.
I think one of the most memorable moments of my life was walking out onto the lava fields at Hawaii volcanoes. And this field off in the distance had these glowing ribbons of light. And we walked in the darkness over the lava fields and came over this rise. And there was the coast of Hawaii. And over was flowing a waterfall of lava, pouring over the top and creating steam down in the bottom. And as the sun came up, we walked farther and farther to and we got to that place, there was heat, there was this acid smell in the air, sometimes almost overpowering. But there you were watching new land. For an Iowan, new land is a great notion. I felt like I was in Earth's maternity ward. That euphoric rush you get if you walk into a maternity ward and see all those little babies. Well, here was, a little bit of land to be made where that lava met the sea. And unlike other parks that preserve the place where the monuments of erosion of things that have been taken away, where glaciers have pushed through, or where water is cut, the Grand Canyon.
In 1604, sailing off the coast of what would one day become the state of Maine, the French explorer Champlain had made special note of an underlying exhaustion that I could not shake. These are a gift. I get up at 5:30 in the morning. I have a lot of kids. I would take it and it would last until an island he named Mount. Before I started taking the elevate and the accelerate, I would typically experience some kind of anxiety. Desert, dominated by looming knobs of bare granite, with tall peaks rising so close to the Atlantic that they catch the nation's first rays of sunlight each morning. For centuries, it had been the home of the Micmac and the Abenaki, the people of the dawn. Then, for the 150 years after Champlain, the French claimed it as part of their North American possessions, calling it Acadia, earthly paradise, before it passed to British and then American hands. The island was a sparsely populated collection of fishing villages until 1844, when the celebrated landscape artist Thomas Cole arrived in search of new scenery for his palette. Because of Cole's influence, the island quickly became the favorite summer locale for other painters, all of them drawing inspiration from the rugged shorelines, pristine lakes, and tranquil forests. Wealthy Easterners began showing up too, to spend the summer far from crowded and polluted cities, at the place the nation's top artists had made fashionable. To accentuate the island's early connection to France, some of the newcomers began calling the island Mount Desert. Soon they were buying up land and building their own summer homes, places with room enough to properly entertain and impress their socially prominent friends. The proud owners had a special name for their new dwellings. They called them cottages.
The future of all our leading seashore places, in truth, belongs to the cottager, and it is really useless to resist him. He moves on all the choice sights with calm and remorselessness. His march along the American coast is nearly as resistless as that of the hordes who overthrew the Roman Empire.
Mount Desert Island was, along with Newport, the social summer institution. This is where the rich and the famous and the patrician families met, played, partied, had their children marry. They are exclusive. They are restricted. They do not welcome people who come from immigrant backgrounds, different backgrounds, white, Protestant, upper class.
But now, one cottager worried that too much of the island was being locked up. As a boy, Charles Elliott had spent many happy summers vacationing with his family on Mount Desert. After joining the landscape architecture firm of Frederick Law Olmsted in Boston, Elliott had been inspired by the great public spaces Olmsted had helped create or preserve, including New York Central Park and Yosemite Valley. Elliott decided to do the same for Mount Desert, ambitiously drawing up a plan to make more of the island accessible to the public. But before he could put any of his ideas to work, Elliott contracted meningitis and died suddenly at age 38. Elliott's grief-stricken father, Charles W. Elliott, came across his namesake's idealistic dreams for Mount Desert. As president of Harvard University, the elder Elliott was in a position to do everything possible to make his son's dream come true. In the late summer of 1901, he summoned his neighbors and reminded them that many of their favorite places to hike and picnic and enjoy a scenic vista were now off limits because of new owners. They established the Hancock County Trustees of Public Reservations to acquire, by gift or purchase from the island's residents, land deemed important for its scenic or historic value, and then hold onto it and manage it for public use.
I had seen the wreckage of the great natural landscape by the hotel builder and the private owner. When President Elliott brought out his plan for the protection and saving of our Mount Desert landscape, it made a strong appeal to me. George Dorr.
George Bucknam Dorr was another cottager on the island. He was nearly 50 years old in 1901, but had never needed to work for a living, thanks to a generous inheritance from his parents, whose investments in the textile industry had placed them among New England's social elite. Now he lived alone in his family's grand house in Bar Harbor, where he carried on the family tradition of entertaining prominent guests, and insisted on taking crackers in his pockets and taking long, rigorous hikes. Dorr quickly became the organization's most dedicated worker, slowly buying up important scenic parcels of the land. Once the trustees had acquired a significant part of the island, they began looking for a way to protect it forever.
To the Secretary of the Interior, Sir, on behalf of the Hancock County Trustees of Public Reservations, State of Maine, I have the honor to offer in free gift to the United States a unique and noble tract of land upon our eastern seacoast.
Oh my God.
Sincerely yours, George Dorr.
But in Washington, Dorr learned that even giving the land away was going to be difficult. At the time, there were no national parks east of the Mississippi, and such an idea to create one from donated land had never been proposed. Horace Albright advised Dorr that Congress could be bypassed and issue an executive order setting aside 5,000 acres of the island as a national monument. For 3 years, Dorr kept at it, and on July 8, 1916, President Wilson finally signed the proclamation. But George Dorr was still not satisfied. If a president could unilaterally create a national monument, Dorr feared, he could just as easily take it away. Although his own inheritance was becoming dangerously depleted, Dorr vowed he wouldn't rest until the national monument became a congressionally authorized, full-fledged, permanent national park.
I can't manage it every day at the same time. I really find it for certain situations only everything. I am dealing with a specific situation now.
The national parks are an American idea, the one thing we have not imported. They came about because earnest men and women became violently excited at the possibility of these great assets passing from the public control.
Years before Stephen Mather arrived in Washington, supporters had argued that the haphazard collection of national parks needed to be brought together under a single federal agency. And yet, bill after bill to create one had died in Congress, the victim of quiet but effective lobbying by powerful commercial interests hoping to exploit park lands, and by John Muir's old nemesis, Gifford Pinchot and his Forest Service. Pinchot believed in natural resources, and most certainly did not want a potential rival within the government.
This nation is richer in natural scenery of the first order than any other nation, but it does not know it. Playgrounds and the best equipped nature schools in the world, and is serenely ignorant of the fact. In its national parks, it has neglected an economic asset of incalculable value.
Stephen Mather's promotional crusade for a national park service now shifted into high gear. Washington had never seen anything quite like it. All over the country, newspapers and magazines ran glowing feature stories about the parks, the result of Mather's constant cultivation of publishers and writers. School children were encouraged to write essays about the parks for cash prizes. The General Federation of Women's Clubs and American Civic Association launched letter writing campaigns. The National Geographic magazine devoted an entire issue to the scenic wonders of America, and Mather made sure a copy was placed on every congressman's desk. Sterling Yard to produce the National Parks Portfolio, a hardbound book of several hundred glossy pages filled with photographs of every national park and every national monument in the country. The book was such a hit, Mather ordered up a smaller paperback version. 2.7 million copies were sold in the first year. Meanwhile, Mather convened a group that drafted the nuts and bolts language of a bill to create a separate Parks Bureau within the Interior Department. Among them was Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., who was asked to add a statement of purpose meant to stand the test of time. It would also enshrine in words the fundamental contradiction that has always been a part of the story of the national parks. The new agency, he wrote, should manage the parks for the enjoyment of the American people, and at the same time keep them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations.
We were aware of and discussed the paradox of use and enjoyment of the parks by the people versus finally come to the belief that with rational, careful, and loving thought, it could be done. Horace Albright.
Detail what was going to be permitted and what wasn't. It'd be like if the founders of our nation had said what they meant by all men being created equal and said, by the way, in case you don't get it, it's all white men of property that are created equal. It wouldn't have been the statement that drew us into the future. Being lofty and broad, it allows us each generation to come to grips with it, just as we do the meaning of liberty.
On August 25, 1916, President Woodrow Wilson signed into law an act creating the National Park Service to oversee 5.5 million acres of some of the most beautiful scenery on Earth. Stephen Mather, whose relentless energy had finally achieved what so many people had been fighting for so many years, was named the new agency's first director. Horace Albright agreed to stay on as his second in command.
The parks will have a constantly enlarging, revivifying influence on our national life, for which there is no other public agency. They are our antidote for national restlessness. They are national character and health builders. They are giving a new impetus to sane living in this country.
Five months later, Mather convened a 5-day conference in Washington, D.C., a gathering of park supporters from across the country to celebrate the park movement. But as the conference went on, Albright found himself having to find someone to fill in as presiding officer because his boss was mysteriously absent from the proceedings. The night after the conference ended, Albright was summoned to the Cosmos Club and ushered into a private room where he found Mather, surrounded by a few of his closest friends.
He was rocking back and forth, alternately crying, moaning, and hoarsely trying to get something said. I couldn't understand a thing. He was incoherent. Suddenly, he broke out of my hold, rushed for the door, and with an anguished cry, proclaimed he couldn't live any longer feeling the way he did. We all understood what he said that time.
They contacted Mather's wife, who asked them to bring him to a family doctor in Pennsylvania. She confided that her husband had suffered a similar breakdown in 1903. 3 subsequent episodes had been prevented from spiraling out of control, she added, only by his retreating into the wilderness solitudes of the West, the trips which had originally inspired his passion for the parks. After accompanying Mather to the doctor, Albright returned to Washington, where he and Interior Secretary Lane agreed to keep Mather's true condition secret until more could be learned about his chances of recovery. In his absence, Albright would serve as acting director. Mather, meanwhile, was sent to a sanitarium outside Philadelphia. His condition worsened at first. Twice he attempted to kill himself, but his wife believed he would pull through, as long as he could be convinced he had something to look forward to. On the wall of his hospital room, she permitted only 2 decorations. Both of them were framed pictures of Yosemite National Park.
When I first saw this tremendous upheaval of mountains, this range before me with McKinley rising in the center, my impressions were exactly the same as those given me by looking down into the Grand Canyon. One was nature carved down into the surface of the earth, and the other was the most magnificent upheaval of nature above it. At such times, man feels his atomic insignificance in this universe. Charles Sheldon.
Among the participants at the National Parks Conference was Charles Sheldon, a Vermont native who had made a fortune in the railroad and mining business, allowing him to retire at age 35 and devote his energies to his personal passion, the study of wild mountain sheep. Like his friend Stephen Mather, Sheldon did not do anything halfway. As an avid hunter and skilled but amateur naturalist, he embarked on field trips to observe North American sheep that took him from the mountains of Mexico all the way up the Rockies through Canada to the territory of Alaska and the highest point on the continent, Mount McKinley, 20,320 spectacular feet above sea level.
And there's something distant and special about that mountain? Well, it's bigger than hell, and it's colder than hell on top. They said it was cold as the heart of an elderly whore. I like it because, unlike Everest, which rises out of a very high plateau, I think the base camp on Everest is something like 16,000 feet high. And here you see the whole magnificence of this peak, rising almost from sea level. It's very thrilling.
The local Athabascan Indians reverently call the perpetually ice-bound and snow-covered mountain Denali, the high one. But in 1896, when the region was still marked as unexplored on official maps, a failed businessman turned prospector who had been arguing politics with his companions dubbed it Mount McKinley after the presidential candidate he happened to be supporting. By 1903, the allure of being the first to scale the continent's tallest summit had begun to attract a handful of adventurers. One of them, Frederick Cook, president of the prestigious Explorers Club, announced that he had made it to the top in a wild dash of 2 weeks and produced a photo to support his claim. But a later expedition proved that Cook had been lying by replicating his photo at one of the mountain's lower peaks as proof of his deceit. A few years later, 4 prospectors in a bar near Fairbanks decided they would claim the honor of being the first to conquer McKinley. Before setting off on their dog sleds, they promised to place an American flag on the summit, where their friends in the bar might see it through telescopes.
And with their bib overalls and boots and canvas parkas and jug of hot chocolate and a couple of donuts, they headed up from their 11,000 foot camp and made it up in one day to the North Peak. Modern climbers just stand in awe of this immense gallop up there, because they went up there with no climbing experience, no route except as they discover it foot by foot. And they got up there and they got back one day.
Sure. Like you were writing it down. This is what people do back in the day. And first you're going to take 10, I 10
Many
steps.
people
The
simply refused to believe their story.
I ate it.
Besides, it was pointed out, the North Peak is actually 850 feet lower than the South Peak.
It's 10, it's 9.
Finally, in 1913,
really?
A team led by Hudson Stuck, Alaska's Episcopal deacon, Karsten, an experienced local, and Walter Harper, the half-Indian son of a fur trapper, made it all the way to the top of the South Peak.
There was no pride of conquest, no gloating over good fortune that had hoisted us a few hundred feet higher than others who had struggled and been discomfited. Rather was the feeling that a privileged communion with the high places of the earth had been granted, and to count from them, seeing all things as they spread out from the windows of heaven itself.
I have often wondered, in listening to descriptions of emotions evoked by the scenery of our national parks, why it was that animals are not more mentioned. Does not, like the spire in the civilized landscape, a wild animal so adorn it that we feel that it is complete? That feeling, the completeness of all your feelings aroused by such wild scenery, will be constantly gratified to the uttermost in this proposed park. Charles Sheldon.
For the naturalist Charles Sheldon, what made the region unique was not just the awe-inspiring mountain, but the abundance of wildlife teeming all around it. Grizzly bears roaming unconcerned about the presence of any other animal, including humans. Moose, which Sheldon described as looking more like prehistoric beasts than any animal we have, made 2 visits to the wilderness around Mount McKinley. One for an entire year, to observe the sheep,
Oh, no.
study their habits, and collect
You were talking
specimens
about
for the American
a
Museum of
thing, and then
Natural
there was
History. Back in New York,
was on that
Sheldon
one like
began
this.
promoting the idea of making McKinley a national park among his fellow members of the Boone and Crockett Club, including the founders, George Bird Grinnell and ex-President Theodore Roosevelt. Without protection, he told them, the wildlife near Mount McKinley would be slaughtered by market hunters.
Charles Sheldon, George Bird Grinnell, Theodore Roosevelt. They were the closest thing that we had in America to aristocracy. Really wealthy people who, because of their heredity, were freed oftentimes from having to go out and make a living. That's as close to royalty as we could get. And while others like them might be using that status, using that wealth to accumulate more for themselves, almost counterintuitively, they were out there looking for patricians, but populists. They were guardians of the greater good, though it wasn't going to necessarily benefit them personally.
The movement for the park that Sheldon initiated occurred at a time when a clubby atmosphere worked very well. It was a small power elite. These people belonged to the same clubs, had gone to the same schools, had innumerable interties with one another. I mean, it was a place where about a dozen people counted, and you could round up those dozen people if you were a Charles Sheldon.
It has been said that the mountains would remain there. Why make it a national park now? The reason for doing it immediately is to save the magnificent herds of game, which are now threatened. They exist there as a link connecting this life with the life of the past ages, just as the records before you.
As they had once done for Yellowstone's wildlife, members of the Boone and Crockett Club swung into action. With his friend Stephen Mather confined to a sanitarium, Sheldon moved to Washington, prowling the halls of the Capitol to push the bill through. On February 26, 1917, he personally delivered it to President Wilson for signing, and ignored his repeated pleas to return the mountain and its new park to its original name, Denali. In the coming decades, the highest peak of North America would continue to attract, challenge, and awe climbers from all over the world, including Bradford and Barbara Washburn from Lexington, Massachusetts.
And a movie company came to Brad and asked him if he would lead an expedition to Mount McKinley. And one of the people from RKO came to me and said, Mrs. Washburn, I understand you've climbed a mountain. Why don't you come on this trip? And I said, well, I can't. I've got 3 little children. I certainly can't do that. And so then they got Brad behind the scenes and said, if you could persuade your wife to go on this trip, it would make a better movie to have a girl in it. But anyway, I went, and it wasn't that bad. It was hard work, at least for me, trudging up the mountain. I had to be concentrating to keep going and not be a problem to anybody and not have to take a rest. When you're on a rope with other guys, you don't want to take a rest.
I think one of the most exciting things about having Barbara on the trip was the fact that we were sharing the beauty with each other. In bed together at night, there in the mountain. And I remember a picture I got of her that year at 18,000 feet, looking down the backside of McKinley. McKinley's an old pal, but you have to set foot on that mountain almost with reference, because if it wants to, it can tear you to pieces. The view from the top was wonderful. I know the fellow who made the first ascent of McKinley, and he was asked later on what the view from the top of McKinley was. And he hesitated for a moment. He said, "That's like looking out." I've never forgotten that. When we left the last time, we both cried. It was like leaving a good friend.
Each idea I have must be tested.
Aren't you glad that you
Each fork of the
built
trail must be examined.
made to him? So that it's good.
No blueprints and no architect. Only the ideal and principles for which the Park Service was created. I think of myself as an explorer in unknown territory. At 27, he was the youngest person in the fledgling organization, 2 years younger than the department's messenger boy. There was so much to be done. Testifying before Congress, embarking on a 10,000-mile inspection of the Western parks, and fending off questions about his boss's whereabouts. Albright's task became even more challenging in April of 1917. The United States entered the Great War that had been raging in Europe for almost 3 years. Western lumber and livestock interests, Wilson was persuaded to reduce the size of Washington's Mount Olympus National Monument by 1/2 in order to open up virgin stands of forest for timber cutting. Ranchers, eager to graze their sheep and cattle in the parks, encouraged friendly newspapers to editorialize that soldiers need meat to eat, not wildflowers. There were even proposals that Yellowstone National Park's elk and buffalo herds be slaughtered for canned meat to send to the troops overseas. Albright did the best he could to protect the parks from it all. When Interior Secretary Lane ordered him to let 50,000 sheep graze in Yosemite Valley, Albright stopped the plan by threatening to resign. During the war, Albright accepted an invitation to visit southern Utah, where the Virgin River carves its way through a beautiful canyon of sandstone cliffs. It had been set aside as a national monument in 1909, named Mukuntuweap, from a Paiute word for canyon, but had been virtually ignored by the federal government ever since. Albright was the first official from the Interior Department to actually see it. Local Utah people said that Yosemite was a Mukuntuweap without color. This didn't faintly prepare me for the reality of the towering broad walls, splashed with brilliant hues of canyons of reds, interspersed with whites. It was love at first sight for me. I was so impressed that I determined we should expand Mukuntuweap and have it made. Albright's enthusiasm was enough to persuade President Wilson to expand the national monument and to change its name from Mukuntuweap, which Albright believed was too hard to pronounce, spell, and remember, to the name the local Mormons used for the canyon, Zion, the New Jerusalem, set aside by God for the pure at heart. At the end of 1919, Congress set it aside as a national park.
I was brought into the world on January 5th, 1914 by a midwife in a lumber shack on the family farm. That's just about where Zion Park headquarters stands today. But as I grew up, of course, I saw the park develop, I saw roads built, I saw the lodges come into being. I can say that I and the park more or less did grow up together. Later, I became a dishwasher at the Zion Lodge. Whenever I got the chance, if I get work done in time, I'd go down and stand outside the recreation hall and listen to the naturalist give his talk. And I was fascinated, of course, mostly by the fact that, gee, here are these rangers that are dressed nicely and they got a good job. Well, I'd like to be one of those. After World War II, as I came home from Europe, I was hired as a seasonal naturalist. I loved it. I used to say, golly, I'd work for nothing except that I had to eat. I don't have any Indian genes in me that I know of. I wouldn't go so far as to say that I consider the peaks, the rocks have life and talk to you. But talk to the mountain and it talks back to me. But that's fantasy, of course. But why not dream a little bit?
That I be the one and only visitor other than Mrs. Mather for a while. His life depends upon national parks, the doctor said. I think I could bring him back through the parks. But without them, I don't know what may happen. 18 months after his collapse, Stephen Mather returned to his job. He threw himself into his work as if he had never been away.
It's been 18 fucking months, dog.
The national parks seem destined to play a role in satisfying the influence of nature. Anyone who has been so fortunate as to witness their marvels and spend quiet hours in the inspiring contemplation of their beauties will surely return home with a burning determination to love and work for, and if necessary, fight and die for, the glorious land which is his.
Our national parks are places of pilgrimage, a place where we return over and over again to be still, to be contemplative, or save these national parks. They save us. There's something about this wild continuity that gives us courage, that allows us to be
Reinvigorated from his time in the parks, Mather became enthusiastic about the scenic attractions of Utah and the southwestern deserts. He pushed for the creation of Arches National Monument, the world's largest collection of exquisite red sandstone architecture, sculpted over the eons by wind, rain, and ice. He also lobbied for what eventually became Great Basin National Park, home of the tough and gnarled bristlecone pines, the oldest living things on Earth, some growing for nearly 5,000 years. And he was instrumental in setting aside a magnificent natural amphitheater, carved by erosion from the side of a mountain ridge, filled with eerie rock spires and minarets called hoodoos. Bryce Canyon National Park. It was named in honor of an early settler, Ebenezer Bryce, who had long since left the area after reportedly saying, "It's a hell of a place to lose a cow."
Slapping Olympics, or whatever that's called.
But now Mather set his sights on an even bigger canyon, whose absence from his list of national parks bothered him more than anything.
Dude, slap us too. That gives you 20 seconds.
There is, of course, no sense at all in trying to describe the Grand Canyon. Those who have not seen it will not believe any possible description. Those who have seen it know that it cannot be described. It is not a showplace, a beauty spot, but a revelation.
Yo, dog.
The Colorado River made it, but you feel when you were there that God gave the Colorado River its instructions. The theme is Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in stone and magic light.
Really? Yeah, we should.
I hear rumors of visitors who were disappointed. The same people will be disappointed at the Day of Judgment. J.B. Priestley.
It is the grandest canyon on Earth, 277 miles long, 10 miles wide, a mile deep, and getting a foot deeper every 1,000 years, as the Colorado River patiently cuts its way through layer upon layer of time. A grand
You just want me to
geological
munch a
library,
box, don't
John
you?
Muir called it.
Damn.
A collection of
Heard
stone
that toe
books,
crack. Calm
tier
down.
on tier, conveniently arranged for the student, from limestone and sandstone and shale, all the way down to some of the oldest exposed rock on Earth.
Hey, toe crack.
Precambrian Vishnu schist, formed 1.7 billion years ago. The home, over thousands of years, of the ancient Puebloans and the Hopi, the Hualapai and Havasupai, the Paiute and the Navajo.
The pimps and the pimps.
It entered recorded history in 1540, when Spanish conquistadors, under the command of Coronado, peered into its depths and were awed and staggered by its immensity, just as every visitor who followed them would be. In 1869, a one-armed Civil War veteran and geology professor named John Wesley Powell, hoping to fill in the biggest remaining gap of unknown territory in the maps of the United States, set off down the Colorado.
My friend, his name is... What?
It was a costly, deadly trip. He began with 5 men and 2 boats. Grand Canyon to national attention. Proposals to make it a national park dated all the way back to the 1880s. But they all had failed in Congress because of fierce opposition from local ranchers, miners, and settlers who did not want the federal government imposing restrictions on what they could and could not do. Then President Theodore Roosevelt heads the Grand Canyon National Monument. The canyon, Roosevelt said, represented the most impressive piece of scenery I had ever looked at. The one great sight which every American should see. Leave it as it is, he had advised the people of Arizona. No one had listened to him. A few rustic hotels were already perched on the canyon's precipice when the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway extended its tracks to the south rim and began construction of even more buildings. Yearly visitation rose into the tens of thousands. Among them, Los Angeles, named Ferdy Groffet, who was so overwhelmed by the experience that years later the memory of it would inspire his masterpiece, the Grand Canyon Suite. Equally impressed was a humorist from Paducah, Kentucky, named Irvin S. Cobb.
I think my preconceived conception of the canyon was the same conception most people have before they come out to see it for themselves. A straight up and down slit in the earth. It is no such thing.
Look at this jump from 926 feet.
Imagine the very heart of the world laid bare before our eyes. There's nothing between you and the Undertaker, except 6,000 feet more or less of dazzling Arizona climate. Having seen the canyon from the top, the next thing to do is to go down into it. Down a winding footpath moves the procession, all as nervous as cats, and some holding to their saddle pommels with death grips. All at once, you notice that the person immediately ahead of you has apparently ridden right over the wall of the canyon. It is at this point that some tourists tender their resignations to take effect immediately. And thousands of others are going to do it, and that no serious accident has yet occurred, which is some comfort, but not much. The natives will tell you the tale of a man who made the trip by crawling around the more sensational corners upon his hands and knees. Presently, when you've begun to piece together the tattered fringes of your nerves, you realize that this canyon is even more wonderful. Apparently, about every other person who came this way remarked to himself,
His canyon was practically completed and only needed his signature as collaborator to round it out. Of all the entrepreneurs who descended upon the Grand Canyon in the early 20th century, hoping to earn a living off its scenery, none worked harder than two brothers from Pennsylvania, Ellsworth and Emery Cole. In 1902, they had opened a photographic studio on the South Rim, at first in a canvas tent near one of the hotels, and then in a wooden structure they built at the head of Bright Angel Trail, the principal route from the rim to the river far below. Every morning, as the muleback caravans began their descent, Emery Cole would take their photograph at a prearranged spot near the trailhead with his 5x7 view camera and enter information about them in his log. Then he would take off down the trail himself, carrying his glass plate negatives as he ran to a makeshift darkroom he and his brother had constructed near a small spring halfway between the rim and the river.
My friend
Cole would develop his pictures, then scurry back up the trail in time to offer the photos for sale when the mule trains returned from the bottom. Each trip to the darkroom was 4.5 miles and 3,000 vertical feet down.
I come over here and I take this.
4.5 miles and 3,000 vertical feet back up. Just under the first terrace, a halt was made while the official photographer took a picture. And when you get back, he has your finished copy ready for you, so you can see for yourself just how pale, haggard, and
when I see this, I look at this and I'm like, who do I like? That big-titted mom in the fucking carpool.
The Cole brothers set off to explore parts of the canyon tourists never experienced, always lugging their bulky camera equipment and often taking great risks to find the perfect vantage point.
Stalactite.
The Grand Canyon the world had ever seen, offered them for sale, and had trouble keeping up with the demand for copies. And when that wasn't enough, in 1911, they decided to retrace John Wesley Powell's historic boat trip down the Colorado and record it not only with still photographs, but with a motion picture camera.
My friend, his name was Joe. I was like, hey dude, my friend was named Ocean's Ball. And he was like, no fucking way. And I was like, that is the craziest fucking shit I've ever heard. And he was like, this is the craziest shit I've ever heard. And he was like, you are the fucking craziest dude I've ever known. You were so big.
The trip took 3 rough, exhilarating months and included a number of close calls on the turbulent river, including one in which Emery insisted on filming his brother's precarious situation before tossing him a life preserver. They emerged with the world's first moving pictures of the raging Colorado and majestic canyon.
Remember, you to be like, oh, dog, dude, there's this one thing. And he was like, oh, dog. My friend was like, oh, dog.
East Coast. And then built an addition to their studio on the canyon's rim to house a small auditorium where every day Emery Cole would personally narrate the film for tourists who had come thousands of miles to see the Grand Canyon, but preferred that at least part of their experience be confined to a movie screen.
We're about to go top of the world. I just
Nearly
want to love
everybody,
you.
on taking a look at the Grand Canyon, comes right out and admits his wonders are absolutely indescribable.
I just remember this one pretty girl.
And then proceeds to
Where she,
write
I don't know.
anywhere from
Where did she live? I don't know.
2,000
But
to
she was
50,000
really pretty.
giving the
Where
full
is she? I
details.
don't know. But she was pretty. I met her
In
like
the
in the
presence of the
summer.
Grand Canyon,
There are two girls I met in this summer. One was from like
fails
Ohio.
you. All the
Another
parts
one
of
might have been
speech
from Ohio.
go
I
dead
don't know.
lame.
But she was really pretty.
Covered
I'm a hustler, baby.
Irvin S. Cobb.
I just want you to know.
In many of the foreign estimates of the
It
great
ain't where
natural
I've
spectacles
been
of America,
the
its
world.
absence from the list of our
Now
national
I
parks,
just want to
therefore,
love you
seems to belittle,
and be
in
who I
foreign
am.
eyes, our entire
And
national
with
park
all this
system.
cash,
What can the system
I'll
amount
forget
to,
you. You'll forget you, man.
if it doesn't even
Now give it to
include
me.
the Grand
Give me that punk, that sweet,
Mather
that
desperately
cash,
wanted the
that
Grand
Gucci
Canyon
stuff.
made into a
But
national
don't
park.
bullshit me.
I
Give
felt
me
it would be a
that,
tremendous
that
boost to his
sweet, that
health and
fresh,
well-being.
that Gucci stuff.
So I put in an enormous amount of
I
time
gotta
and
call
energy
it,
in the
post
project.
and be like, hey, don't let it earlier go. And then I started breastfeeding all
In their quest to add the canyon to the system of parks they were building, Stephen Mather and Horace Albright
about
found
which to
themselves
speak.
blocked at every
What?
turn
Right.
by a man who considered the canyon his own private domain and was unafraid
Right.
to take on the federal government, the Santa Fe Railroad,
The
or anyone
colors
else
of
who
the
got in his
rainbow.
way.
So pretty
I was
in the
exploring the
sky
Grand Canyon
are
before other
also
men ever
on the
knew
face
there, which all
of
prospectors expect to make. And I've always said that I would make more money out of the Grand Canyon than any other man. Ralph Henry Cameron.
Ralph Henry Cameron was a prospector whose opinion of himself was as grand as the canyon he planned to exploit. A few of Cameron's mines actually yielded some valuable ore, but the vast majority of his claims seemed conveniently located on the most scenic spots along the South Rim, and he never seemed to do much mining on them. At one claim, near the head of the Bright Angel Trail, which he preferred to call the Cameron Trail, he built a cabin, named it Cameron's Hotel, and dispatched employees to hound tourists getting off the train to patronize it. On the trail itself, he erected a gate at the rim, where his brother would collect a toll of $1 a person for its use. When Coconino County was declared the trail's proper owner, Cameron used his influence as a county commissioner to be awarded the franchise to continue collecting the tolls. Halfway down the trail, at a small oasis called Indian Gardens, he operated a ramshackle tent camp, where he charged passing travelers outrageous prices for water, then charged again for the only outhouses between the rim and the river. Meanwhile, as Stephen Mather steadily built support in Congress for his park proposal, federal officials ruled virtually all of Cameron's claims invalid because of their lack of mineral value.
Yoshi.
The Secretary of the Interior ordered him to abandon them. Cameron ignored it all and instead filed 55 new claims, bringing his total to 13,000 strategically placed acres. In a lawsuit working its way toward the Supreme Court, his lawyers were even arguing that Theodore Roosevelt's executive order creating the national monument had been illegal. In 1919, Congress at last passed a bill creating Grand Canyon National Park. A year later, when the Supreme Court finally and unequivocally ruled against Cameron, Mather and Albright figured that their troubles with him were over at last. They couldn't have been more wrong. In the election of 1920, Arizona sent him to Washington as a United States Senator. I feel like getting even, Cameron had written a friend, and if I live, I certainly will.
And then I just ate this guy named Cameron's mom. Like, I'm on Strabats, I'm not a cannibal. Well, I've been very fucking hungry before. I've never been so hungry that I wanted to eat someone. But you would see on this.
I never had any doubt about the existence
to the point where I thought about eating, like,
to see a tree coming out in the spring was enough to impress me with the fact that God existed.
body.
John D.
I like how they're like, oh, it wouldn't really be good to have like.
John D. Rockefeller Jr. was the only son of the richest and some said most hated man in America, John D. Rockefeller Sr., the founder of the vast Standard Oil Trust, which at the time refined more than 90% of the oil sold in America. John D. Jr. had been raised in accordance with his father's strict Baptist creed, to work hard, to watch every penny, and remember to give to charity. Mount Desert Island with his wife Abby, a New Englander who instilled in him an abiding love of the Maine coast. 2 years later, he purchased an estate near Seal Harbor on the quiet side of the island, where his growing family could spend their summers in relative privacy and enjoy what he called one of the greatest views in the world. That same year, at age 36, Rockefeller had made a momentous decision. He would step away from the pursuit of even greater wealth, a single goal. The social purposes, he said, to which a great fortune could be dedicated. Then he was introduced to George Dorr, who was still seeking funds to acquire even more land on Mount Desert Island, and still hoping to turn the new national monument into a national park.
George Dorr is an impulsive, enthusiastic, eager person who works at high tension, neglects his meals, sits up too late at night, and rushes about from one pressing thing to another. But he is very diligent, as well as highly inventive.
Rockefeller soon became Dorr's principal patron. As he quietly began buying up land, Rockefeller also launched the most ambitious network of wilderness carriage roads New England had ever seen, not only paying for it all, but overseeing every detail. Meant for the aesthetic enjoyment of people riding in open carriages, on horseback, or on a bicycle, each bridge, made of local granite so it would blend into its setting, was individually designed, including one that was in the same line of sight as the bridge's arch. By the time he was through, Rockefeller had built 57 miles of carriage roads, $1 for the dream that had begun as young Charles Eliot's fanciful notion, his father's noble tribute, and George Dorr's magnificent, enthusiastic about the plans. Having a national park in the east, closer to the nation's major population centers, would help build support for the larger system he was trying. Eventually named Acadia, the French word for heaven on earth.
Streams that a government itself will change, but its possession by the people will remain. George Dorr.
George Dorr was now 65. Despite his age, he was immediately named superintendent. He would remain in that job for the next 25 years. To the cause that when he died in 1944, his estate had money for his funeral only because its trustees had secretly put $2,000 aside to prevent Dorr from giving it all away. Two wealthy matrons enjoying lunch on the terrace of their summer cottage looked up as some of the plane's wafting cargo drifted down into their teacups. "Oh dear," one of them exclaimed. "It's Mr. Dorr."
One of my favorite Robert Frost poems is West Running Brook, where he describes this beautiful stream coming down, and the narrator is pointing out this one spot in the brook where the water hits a rock and is thrown backward. The beauty of that spot where it sparkles in the light. And he says it's from that we spring. He said the beginning of the beginnings. And I think national parks are part of that. that sparkle in the water. Life pushes us forward. Our society moves forward in a great rush, but it points us back to the source, to the beginning of beginnings. And that's their value, and that's their beauty.
National parks could now be found in the territories of Hawaii and Alaska, from the coast of Maine to the canyons of Utah and Arizona. And there was a new agency trying to figure out how to care for them all. Stephen Mather could eat out, but he was feeling strong again and bursting with more ideas. Ideas that would bring even more Americans to their parks.
What is it that inspires love of the flag, that tunes the ear of America to sing, "My country 'tis of me"? Is it industrial efficiency? Irrigation statistics? Is it the grim powerhouse in which is harnessed Niagara? Is it the blackened waste that follows the devastation of much of our forest wealth? Is it the smoking factory of the grimy mill town? The malodorous wharves along navigable rivers? Is it even the lofty metropolitan skyscraper that shuts out the sun and throws its dismal shadow over all below?
Oh, fuck.
No. Our devotion to the flag is inspired by love of country.
You heard it here first, kids.
Patriotism,
something went on in Memphis.
The religion of the soil. And national parks are our richest patrimony.
Come on by. We'd love to see you. Do you still drive? If you look at the war on Christianity, people killed in Ukraine by Zelensky, okay? The Donbass region, all these things. And
that great vastness and that great timelessness. The first time I floated the river, I almost was puzzled and didn't like the fact that I was so awestruck. Because I've seen a lot of other wonderful places. You know, I've been to Glacier Bay, I've been in Yosemite, I've lived at Mount Rainier. So why should it's an amazing place. And you can really experience it. Not look at it, but experience it. Be part of it. Hear the constancy of the river's flow. Maybe that constancy is a part of it, that there's something bigger than yourself. Well, you know that, but you don't feel it until you get into the Grand Canyon. To go inside, you go outside because you need to know yourself in context. Not the most essential you that is there.
In late 1915, on the train ride back from San Francisco to their home in Lincoln, Nebraska, Margaret and Edward Gerke decided to take the one-day side excursion to the Grand Canyon offered by the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. Margaret had never seen anything like it before in her life.
A few things in this beautiful old world are too big to talk about. One can only weep before so supreme a spectacle of glory and of majesty.
Margaret was 32, a lover of books and poetry who had read and admired John Muir. She taught school until shortly after she married Edward, a plumber who had gone into the house building business. Edward's passion was dogs and fishing, and photographing everything he saw. Margaret's was dreaming about the yearly excursions the childless couple began taking once Edward's business started to flourish. Over the course of nearly 30 years, Margaret would record the start of every trip as the day of days in her journal. Edward would bring along his Kodak camera, snapping pictures Margaret would later carefully place in photo albums to commemorate their adventures.
Let those who will buy lands and hoard money. We will have our memories, glad memories of golden experiences together.
In 1917, the Gerkes took the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy line to Yellowstone, the nation's oldest park. The Great Northern took them to Glacier National Park.
We have seen much in a short time, but still, I have not found the peace I seek. I have found 5 hotels filled with crowds. I've seen beautiful scenery, but not the deep silence of
the far shore of Lake McDonald.
We have a wonderful location.
What did he do?
Camped in a forest of tall pines overlooking the lake.
They lingered there for 11 days.
Oh my God, his face is in the same colors as well.
August 21st, our last day here. It has been all we dreamed it would be. For in this trip, like all the others, we have laid up for ourselves treasures. we have remembered to live. The come home on Edward's birthday was nice, if returning home can ever be said to be pleasant. August 27th, the housekeeping wheels begin. I swept and dusted, thoroughly cleaned the front rooms.
To report Medicare fraud, call 855-613-7080.
Margaret was already dreaming of more national parks beckoning her and Edward.
Travel, work, family, or just for fun. The Rosetta Stone app makes it easy to get started and stay motivated to reach your goals. Right now, get a lifetime.
And although the railroads had introduced them to the parks, in the future, the Gerkes would travel a different way. Outside their house in Lincoln sat a new Buick, one of 17 Edward would own.
Hold on. Delete me, would you? You did? Okay. Delete me. So when you physically delete me, hit John and Ken. Live 1 to 4 p.m. on KFI and on demand anytime on the iHeartRadio app.
In the next 20 years.
Dude, 6,000.
Gangs are in the business of crime. They don't do anything else but commit crimes all day. Live 1 to 4 p.m. on KFI and on demand anytime on the iHeartRadio app. KFI AM 640. Untangling the mess until it makes sense.
Los Angeles, Orange County, live everywhere on the iHeartRadio app.
Deputy Dan, Amanda Caravello from the KFI 24-hour newsroom. An off-duty LA County Sheriff's deputy has died in Santa Clarita. The Sheriff's Department says the deputy killed himself at Naples Roadhouse Bar on Lee Canyon Road. LA County Fire Service responded to a call from around 1:30 Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Luna had gone to the Santa Clarita Sheriff's Station to meet with deputies this morning, though the deputy was not assigned to that station. Steve Gregory, KFI News.
No, there should be some kind of leave. That's it. If you don't get paid, you can maybe get somehow. Because you can just have it to anybody. But they could have like, oh, Glenn Sicker did it. Okay. I don't know.